now, people don't know her that well.
I think it'll be an open process, but I don't see who runs against her.
There are some long-term implications, but I think in the near term, this is not something that's probably easily tradable.
The market doesn't seem to be interpreting Harris as a very strong candidate that could challenge Trump.
People underestimate Harris at their peril.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Let's try and get your trading week started. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning, good morning. For our audience worldwide, Bloomberg Surveillance starts right now at a time where for many of you, it feels like last week never ended. Another weekend in American politics, Lisa, which will never be forgotten.
Unprecedented. I think a lot of people are talking about this. Unprecedented that you have the sitting president step aside this close to an election, just a little bit more than 100 days left before what we see in November. Key question here, why is this not roiling markets more, considering that it is unprecedented from a whole host of reasons?
The race for the White House resetting right now, and the list of Harris endorsements long and growing, with one notable absence. We do not see the former President Barack Obama's name on that list right now.
No, he came out and gave this tribute to President Biden. But also, this really is how Obama does things. This is what happened 4 years ago, and he said he doesn't want to put his thumb on the scale. This was when the Biden camp really wanted Obama to come out and endorse Harris, and he waited. So this is how he does things. So potentially he wants to make sure that this is done right. Harris fully gets the nomination, gets the delegates behind her, and then he'll come out with an endorsement. People close to him say that he does want to get behind her, but he's going to wait. Maybe view himself as an elder statesman of the party. But also Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, when are they going to come out and potentially endorse Harris? Because yesterday, really, you had the floodgates opening to embrace her.
So that's the first question we've got to ask here on Wall Street. What happens now? Does the party get behind Harris, or do we see a real challenge? The next one, and I think a lot of you are all asking the same question, how do they differ on policy? Isaac Bortansky of BTIG writing this morning, the focus should be on electability rather than policy. Electability and not on policy.
And his point here, and I thought that that was a really important point, was that Kamala Harris is probably a little bit more progressive than Joe Biden. And yet Joe Biden's policies were arguably more progressive than some of his stated positions have been over the decades that he's served in office. So it means that there's not very much daylight in the policy. Question will be whether it does galvanize more voters down the ballot and bring more Democrats into the fold. This is sort of the big concern from a lot of people going into the election. On a bigger scale level, this might explain why there's not a big shift, as well as this feeling that on the margins, Trump, as he said, still the favored candidate going into this race to win.
And Trump coming out and saying there's not a lot of distance between Biden and Harris. They want to paint her, as he did in his speech. He kept talking about this administration. Two things stand out for me, though. Grassroots momentum. Overnight, you saw Harris bring in some $50 million when this came out. Endorsements, not just from individuals in the party, but you see some celebrities coming out, also throwing their weight, excitement behind her. And second, Pew Research had earlier this year the amount of double haters for Trump and Biden at an all-time high in this election cycle. She is a new name. Even though she's attached to Biden, she is a new name, and now she's going to have a new name, if she is the nominee, as a VP.
The enthusiasm is back in the party. That's what it feels like in the last 24 hours. If you think that energy was the only thing missing, big change. If you thought that age was the biggest problem, big change. If you think it's policy, if you think that's the issue, got to ask, Lisa, how much change is there overnight?
This is the reason why the million-dollar question at this point really is who she picks as vice president. Does she pick someone who's from a purple or red state to try to create this feeling that she's catering to a broader centrist type of platform? Does she pick someone that hews more closely to the sort of progressive ideals? That's the reason why people are looking more to that to understand. You also asked a question yesterday in the special that you guys did. It was a great job where you said if Donald Trump had known that Joe Biden was going to drop out, would he have picked J.D. Vance as his running mate? And that is going to be an increasing point going forward.
Potentially not, because J.D. Vance historically has been very anti-abortion. He's kind of tried to hone that in now. Trump doesn't even want to talk about it, didn't mention it once in his 93-minute speech. This is something she is going to lean on, especially if she wants to galvanize women to come out and vote. This is something that President Biden struggles to talk about as a Catholic. He really doesn't like to talk about abortion. She has led that charge. charge. Her one big vulnerability, which is a top issue for Americans, is immigration. Because of March of 2021, Biden said to her, I want you to look at the root causes of migration. And many would say that that was a failure.
If you are just joining us, welcome to the programme. Let's get straight to this price action. Equity futures on the S&P 500 firmer by 0.4%. There is a lift in the equity market. The bond market looks a little something like this. Yields are lower by about a basis point. The 10-year 422.72. Lisa, a lot to work through this week.
This week is going to be divided into three parts. Kamala Harris is speaking today at 11:30 a.m. and it sort of kicks off the progress of how this crazy development, this sort of crazy whipsawing of activity in the Democratic Party continues to evolve ahead of the August 19th convention. I'm also watching on Tuesday. Big tech kicks off earnings. You get Alphabet reporting after the bell, really starting to gut check how much the rotation that's been happening also, by the way, in the past couple of weeks, how much that has legs versus a revival back to big tech. And then I think that actually jobless claims and continuing claims on Thursday might actually even supersede PCE on Friday, just simply because last week, what we saw was continuing claims climbing to the highest level going back to 2021 and a real remarkable rise. To me, those are some of the sort of hallmark moments in addition to bond auctions, which we won't get into.
Politics, data, bond auctions.
I'm not going to get into that. It's actually not that important this week relative to all these other things.
At the earnings as well, I just want to bring up Ryanair just briefly. Ryanair is down by 15% in European trading. That is another airline reporting a very difficult Q2, and we've seen that on repeat over the last couple of weeks.
Talking about having to lower prices, that essentially consumers are a lot more sensitive, although they're sort of tempering some of their guidance, saying just a bit more sensitive. That's the kind of information that might dictate the direction of markets more than some of the tumult in the political sphere, simply because people don't understand the possible policy implications, and it doesn't look like they might be that great.
More on that in just a moment. Coming up this hour, here's the lineup for you. Terry Haines of Pangaea policy as President Biden steps aside. RBC's Lori Calvasina as investors rethink the Trump trade, and Kit Juckes of SocGen as the dollar slips following Biden's decision. We begin with our top story, plunging into uncharted territory. President Biden abandoning his re-election bid, throwing his support behind Kamala Harris, the endorsements flooding in for the vice president, and so too the donations. Democratic fundraising platform ActBlue calling yesterday the biggest fundraising day of the 2024 cycle. Terry Haines of Pangaea Policy joins us now for more. Terry, great to catch up with you again this morning. It's about process for us and what happens next. Let's start with this. Does this party get behind one candidate, or do you see a challenge coming?
Oh, I think they get behind one candidate fairly quickly. You know, they've done huge damage to their brand in the last month, and they need to recapture voter trust as much as anything else. And it does not do for them to have a big fight, particularly with the sitting vice president and this particular vice president with her pedigree and her background. So, you know, I think what you're going to have is you're going to have consistent nods to the idea that the delegates really need to be comfortable with the choice, but the party itself is coalescing pretty quickly around Harris. And as was said, the vice presidential nomination process takes up a lot of the oxygen.
Well, the DNC has come out and said that in due time, they're going to quickly let the American voters know what is going to happen next. Do they bring up the virtual roll call and basically go into August 19th in Chicago with the ticket in hand, ready to go?
I think that's still very much an open question, Anne-Marie, and it's a very good question. You know, they've still got this particular arrow in their quiver, and I think one of the reasons why, or the key reason why Biden dropped out really is that they were facing a delegate revolt. So I think the answer to the question of whether they do the virtual nomination depends in large part on the degree of comfort that the delegates show. If Harris is there by acclamation, essentially, then they probably go forward. But again, the vice presidential pick complicates things too, and there may be a more open process for the vice presidential nomination than you've seen in past years. I think the last time the Democrats nominated somebody in an open convention for vice president was 1956, when a young senator named John Kennedy contested it and lost, but used it as a springboard for his 1960 campaign.
Reports that yesterday Kamala Harris got on the phone with Roy Cooper, Andy Beshear, Josh Shapiro. When you look at these three names, what ticket do you think sets her up better to compete with Trump Vance?
I think what they need a geographic balance ticket, and they need frankly, I think they need a swing state governor on the ticket. That strikes me kind of as Captain Obvious analysis, but I think it is. It's absolutely essential. They've shown weakness in the swing states. It's capturable. They need somebody that actually kind of knows that ground and can speak center speak more than anything else, and it has a background of being successful with centrist voters, and that is how you counter today's small Trump advantage and the plans they have for Vance, obviously.
Thierry, how do Democrats counter the Republican accusations that this really isn't the sort of democracy that they espouse, that basically there wasn't a real robust primary voting season, and to the extent that there was, it was basically just undermined in the shortest period of time ahead of an election in history? How do Democrats respond?
They won't respond. They'll turn the page absolutely as quickly as possible. Two things. One, the moment before Biden dropped out yesterday, Biden was down 3 to Trump in the 2-day polling averages, and those polls are registered voter polls that have bigger margins of error than that 3-point spread. So Democrats have been bad-mouthing Biden's chances for quite a lot of time, but they are going to pivot on a dime, probably already have started to saying, well, you know what, we're quite competitive to begin with, and what Harris brings us is a great boost of energy and money. And as far as a candidacy goes, Harris is pretty much plug and play. I mean, she's really good on the issues that the Democrats think they can sway, not only excite their base on, but sway independent voters. And that's really the key to the election.
Hey, Terry, great to catch up with you again, sir. Terry Haines there of Pangaea Policy on the latest. If you are just joining us, your price action looks like this on the S&P, firmer by 0.4%. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Senator Joe Manchin is considering a run for president. The West Virginia senator, who turns 77 next month, is the first to express interest in challenging VP Harris for the nomination. He would, though, have to rejoin the Democratic Party to do so. He had left in May to become an independent. Manchin is expected to sit down for an interview with Fox News' Bret Baier later today, and before that, MSNBC's Morning Joe. A check on Ryanair shares falling this morning by the most in 4 years. It cut its outlook for ticket prices in this crucial summer travel period. It said that fares will be materially lower in the second quarter with a more cautious consumer. Ryanair saw fares drop 15% in the fiscal first quarter. It previously had seen fares flat to modestly up. Speaking of airlines, Delta is apologizing for canceling thousands of flights during the busiest travel weekend of the summer. Many of its systems failed following that catastrophic CrowdStrike outage on Friday. The CEO, Ed Bastian, blamed the impact on a significant number of functions that rely on Microsoft Windows operating system. That includes its crew tracking tool, making the airline unable to process large volumes of changes to flight personnel. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Hey, Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Up next on the programme, rethinking the Trump trade.
The market doesn't seem to be interpreting Harris as a very strong candidate that could challenge Trump, and that actually is perfectly reflected in her approval rating.
That conversation just around the corner, live from New York City this morning. Good morning. So when futures started trading yesterday, I think the one thought we all had is, let's see where small caps are. This is where small caps are right now, positive by 0.1%. Lisa, the underperformance is notable. The outperformance in big tech up by 0.7%. The political considerations front and center.
The idea that the rotation trade really was the Trump trade. The idea that basically you'll have small caps outperform and you'll have big tech that could potentially underperform because of increased sanctions and tensions with China. Do we see a real reversal of that? That is one of the key questions of this week.
This right here is one to watch. Under surveillance this morning, rethinking the Trump trade.
The market doesn't seem to be interpreting Harris as a very strong candidate that could challenge Trump, and that actually is perfectly reflected in her approval rating until we get clarity that this is the actual choice, and potentially there's a chance for Harris to resurface her image. That could be something that could cause her odds to go up. If we've learned anything over the last 3 weeks, it's that things can change very quickly.
Apparently every single day. Here's the latest. Stock futures advancing, Treasury yields easing as President Biden steps aside and endorses Kamala Harris. Lori Calvasina of RBC writing this. If the change swings momentum back to the Democrats, it could be fuel for a short-term pullback that may already be underway. If Trump expands his lead, historical data suggests that stocks may avoid the pullback we've been worried about. Lori joins us now for more. Lori, good morning.
Thanks for having me.
What changed yesterday afternoon for this market?
So I think, and look, we, by the way, said those relationships we've seen all year between Trump and betting markets and the market, those could change, right? So we're in a little bit of a discovery process this week. Look, I think we got maybe a little bit more certainty yesterday. We looked at the futures reaction last night. It was initially very muted. It's moving a little bit more right now. But really, investors have had a couple of weeks to be thinking about this, to be contemplating this. And I think at this point in time, right, we've seen a number of curveballs, a number of twists and turns. We just got another one. And so for me, what really changed is that this race is still an open question.
So let's sit on small caps and talk about how to trade them. You had cautioned before this rally not to be too underweight small caps. There's three pillars to it. It's earnings, we hope they improve. It's rates, people think they're going to drop. And it's Trump. People think it's going to be a small cap presidency. Let's just reflect on the moves we've seen in the last couple of weeks. How much was it about one versus the other, or was it all of the above?
So I'm not going to sit here and say the election didn't have some sort of role, right? Because if you go back historically, 2016, 2017, 2018, if you look at CFTC futures data, there were three big Trump trades. One was on him getting elected and excitement over the economy. One was over corporate tax reform, and one was over the trade war. So there's certainly precedents. And we did hear investors talk about that, especially non-U.S. investors, earlier in the year. That being said, over the past week or so, what I think has really been driving the small caps in my conversation, it's been really more about the Fed. It's been more about inflation. Because I think, when we talk to investors about the Trump agenda, there have been concerns that it could be inflationary, that it could keep interest rates elevated, a bit higher, even if you get the cuts. Are we in a higher for longer environment? Those are things that kind of dampen enthusiasm for the small cap trade. So has it mattered? Yes. Was it the whole enchilada? No.
So basically, is the Trump trade essentially, or has it been sort of a fiction? And has it been much more tied to economic data that's supportive of a Fed rate cut and some other factors that kind of underpin some of the weakness that we've seen even in big tech?
So I would venture to say that in financials, there's probably been a little bit more of a Trump bid, because that's been the one sector all year I've been hearing investors say, if you want to buy something on a Trump win, it makes sense from a regulatory perspective, right? But if you think about energy, I think it's just been a little bit more complicated. And that's the one I was hearing investors question more last week, is if it really made sense on a Trump 2.0 trade this time around.
You brought two dolls into the office today, and you don't have to show them, but it's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. You stole them from your kids. Good luck having that conversation. It raises this question for me. We hear analyst after analyst saying, we don't know how it's going to matter. It's not going to matter that much. We're seeing muted reaction. And yet you've got two props with you to take with you on your meetings that have to do directly with politics. And that's the bulk of all the conversations that analysts are having. So what are people asking? And what are you telling them other than, we don't know?
Look, I think the reality is this is a big pocket of uncertainty, and I think that's what happens in most presidential election years. And we do tend to see some sell-offs. We do tend to see some sort of uptick in volatility, and that is normal. So I think what we're trying to caution people is that as many times as we're all using the word unprecedented, historic, monumental, there is some normalcy to all of this. I also think, we've talked a lot on this program about kind of the investor reaction to talking about the election as staring at the sun. I think it has been a very, very difficult thing for people to talk about. It's been a very difficult thing for people to analyze. And what, maybe I have wishful thinking in here, but maybe with things having been so shaken up, now that we've got a VP pick on the Republican side, at some point we're going to know that on the Democratic side as well. Maybe it'll be a little bit easier to analyze policy going forward. I think investors, whatever their opinions are on things, I think that's what investors have really wanted to do, is be able to really focus on policy.
When it comes to policy, you actually ran a playbook for Harris during the 2020 nomination process. What differentiates her from Joe Biden?
So it's interesting, and I think a lot of investors are probably doing this right now, right? We do have a little bit of a playbook. And remember, we had all those candidates back in the Democratic primary in 2019. And we didn't analyze all of them. There were too many. But we looked at Warren, Sanders, we looked at Harris, and we looked at Biden. And we had, 2 pages worth of issues, and we mapped them to sectors. We did an enormous amount of work going through all of their commentary, on things like taxes and trade and that sort of thing. What we generally found was that you had sort of Warren and Sanders over to the left, and then you had Biden and Harris more, kind of on the center, and Harris was somewhere in between the two. And look, I think, her views have likely evolved, so I don't want to make too much of this. But I do think in general, I was sort of shocked when I looked on the page how many times I saw taxing financials show up for things not necessarily related to financials. So are people going to be digging that kind of stuff up? Perhaps. She seemed a bit tougher from our notes on energy than Biden had, more kind of in line with Warren and Sanders. And on big tech, and this was in focus for me because of all the, sort of kerfuffle in the middle of last week over what the Vance pick meant. We had just made some notes that it seemed like Harris was less onerous to big tech than Warren, or Sanders maybe more in the Biden camp. And, we had jotted down on the page, we need more investigation. We need to do more work here. Whereas the others were more in the camp of let's break them up. She wasn't quite there.
And this is why the performance in NASDAQ futures is particularly notable today. We spent the last week thinking about being short Meta and long Bitcoin off the back of a Trump presidency. Yeah. Kind of half joking, but ultimately seriously, because it feels like they are against big tech. If they get a second term, if Donald Trump gets a second term. Did the earnings matter? I just want to understand what you're telling clients this morning. We go into Google tomorrow. Google's up by something like 27% so far year to date. Did the earnings matter when the politics begin to dominate as we progress through this year?
I think the earnings always matter. And I would say, our number one line right now, the phrase that gets stuck in my head is proceed with caution. And that can be in regards to the broader market and the potential for a pullback. But it's also, when I think about investors who have to make their year, right? Like as much as I would like to be a 3 to 5 year person and just think about these longer term shifts, we have a lot of people who need to get their portfolios right between now and the end of the year. So when we're thinking about that latter part and people are starting to really jump on this rotation trade and say now, I am in the camp that the seeds have been planted, the stage has been set, the pressures are there on valuation and positioning, but the earnings do matter. And I have this one chart where we look at the dominance of the Mag 7 versus the rest of the market on earnings growth. It was astronomical last year. That's how you got to these elevated PEs. That earnings dominance is expected to shrink. But the problem is, how do you get the rest of the market to catch up to the Mag 7? Or how do you get the rest of the market to catch up to those top 10 market caps? You need economic tailwinds, and those seem like they're dissipating a little bit right now. So that is the thing I'm struggling with. I really want to see which way the earnings go. If value, these kind of financials, energy, those kinds of sectors can really make their case that they're ramping up earnings growth despite these macro tailwinds that we've got, I think that supercharges your rotation trade. But if they kind of fall on the side and the big tech names, continue their dominance, maybe things get a little bit better, I can see investors going back there pretty easily.
Which brings us to sort of the 3 pillars of the week, which is the dominance of politics, this question around earnings, and then this issue of the economy and just how much that's not the tailwind that you're talking about. How much of a drawdown based on the extreme positioning that you see could we see in the equity market if we don't see the economy cooperating and it does continue to roll over?
So it depends on what you mean by rollover. Are we just kind of softening, or are we talking recession? If we're just getting a little bit of a softening, a little bit of a pothole, so to speak, I think that's worth 5 to 10% and maybe closer to 10. Anything more than 10%, if you look back the last 10 years or so, that's when we've gone into periods like early 2018 or later 2018. That's when we've gone into 2015, 2016, when recession risks are very real and very raw. And I don't see us really quite getting there.
Laurie, great to see you. Laurie Calvasina of RBC. Just on the earnings point, we mentioned this a little bit earlier this morning. We have to keep going back to it. The airlines have been so disappointed. It started with Delta, United followed up. It's not local, it's international, it's Ryanair as well. All these different markets grappling with a similar issue.
But trying to message it differently and saying that actually we're just coming off a pretty high base. It doesn't make sense if you look at how crowded airplanes are, which brings us to this idea it must signify a real pushback by the consumer. Friday, we do get personal income and personal spending as well as PCE. Do we see that reflected in some of the overall numbers at a time where a lot of the earnings are suggesting it really is an issue?
I know many of you have struggled with airports across the weekend off the back of the tech outage on Friday. Mike McKee struggling to get back to the studio. Mike's not with us today.
Yeah, well...
You see that?
You think that's the reason why?
Yeah, no, he said.
Okay.
Delayed planes. They were offering different flights.
That's really convenient.
Different airline. He flew Delta.
So did I.
And he said Delta had some very specific problems.
Yeah, well, it was kind of, that's something else. Microsoft is up this morning after all that. Can you believe it?
Coming up, Kit Juckes of SocGen on the dollar slipping following Biden's decision to step aside. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning. Here's a snapshot of the price action. On the equity benchmark on the S&P, firmer by 0.5%. The outperformance on the Nasdaq 100, we're up by 0.8%. The underperformance on the Russell, the small caps up by 0.25%. Some freezing cold, ice cold water poured over the small caps from Morgan Stanley and Mike Wilson this morning. Here we go. What's driven the small cap rotation? Will it continue? In our view, it was the combination of a soft CPI print and the rise in the odds of a Trump win, catalyzing a positioning-driven rotation towards small caps. They say this now: while we're respectful of still light sentiment and positioning in small caps, we see limited fundamental and macro justification for small cap outperformance continuing, Lisa, in a durable manner.
At a time when a lot of people are expecting the weakness to continue, and this is the key point. At a certain point, if you do get jobless claims continuing to tick upward, if you do see personal spending continue to go down, and something of the voice that we've heard from airlines continues to be represented in a number of other earnings, does that turn the tide on a business cycle that a lot of people have been waiting to turn?
Stay on the Nasdaq and let's sit there. Let's go from the small caps to the Nasdaq 100. Some real underperformance on the Nasdaq 100 over the last few weeks. The Nasdaq this morning firmer by 0.9%. We've talked a lot about this administration. If it gets a second term under Donald Trump, how much they'd go after big business, big tech. We went through the thoughts of Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio. And Lisa, we've talked about this repeatedly. They would be the party, the government that might go after some of these big names. How much did yesterday afternoon change that story?
TBD, right? A lot of people will see how much Kamala Harris does gain some clout in the polls. On the margins, it changes it quite a bit if you believe that this does re-energize not just the electoral base when it comes to who's president, but also some of the other representatives in the House, in the Senate, whether that changes the down ballot race. That will make a difference. What Lori Calvasina just said there, really important. Basically, in 2016, Kamala Harris was actually more friendly to big tech than even some of her other Democratic compatriots. So perhaps that explains some of the outperformance.
The Nasdaq picking up this morning. Let's switch at the board and turn the page and get to the bond market. The good news this week is the quiet period. No Fed speak. The Fed decision next Wednesday. Not this Wednesday, next Wednesday. In the bond market, the front end of the curve, the 2-year just in and around 450, 451.49. We've talked a lot about the tug of war between the politics and the data. Let's talk about the tug of war within the economic data. Retail sales good. Last week, upside surprise. Jobless claims, less good. The wrong kind of upside surprise. Let's try and work that out.
Well, what a lot of people are doing is saying it's Goldilocks, because what you do when you get confusion is you just simply go back to the tropes that have worked in the past. The concern that a lot of people have said is, and this is the reason why initial jobless claims to me is arguably the most important, that is possibly the one high-frequency data point that tends to be most correlated to a turn in the business cycle. Retail spending is hard to kind of get too much faith in terms of indicators, just simply because of what we're hearing from a lot of companies themselves. Mohamed El-Arian talking about listen to the companies. What are they saying? Consumers are pushing back. They are not spending as freely.
Seeing that across the board. Earnings season did not start well. Delta, Pepsi, others following up with a similar theme. We'll pick up on that in just a moment. I want to turn to foreign exchange. The euro right now not doing much against the dollar, just short of 109, 108.88. Under surveillance this morning, our top story, President Biden abandoning his re-election bid, throwing his support behind Kamala Harris. The vice president is the favourite for the Democratic nomination, but could face competition from independent Senator Joe Manchin, who is considering reportedly rejoining the party to run on the Democratic ticket. How much of a challenge are we about to get?
Well, this isn't really going to be a real challenge. He clearly wants something, and he feels the need to put his name in there. He's not even registered Democrat right now. But this is the shortest presidential race we're going to see in history. So if you want something out of this potential next 2.0 of this administration, you got to act quickly. It's a little bit interesting because earlier in the day, he said Biden should pass the torch. And then when asked if he would consider running on Face the Nation, he said no, it should go to a new generation. So I think that's really where he is. But he clearly just wants to, parties are moving right now. He potentially wants more of an open convention. He said that. So this is his way of trying to sway where the party is right now, because right now they are all coalescing around Kamala Harris for the most part.
If he wanted to make a move, and it's difficult for him to make a move, you've gone through the process, he starts from zero. Kamala Harris does not. Listen to some of these numbers. The donations pouring in for the vice president. Democrats raising more than $50 million just yesterday. ActBlue calling it the biggest fundraising day of the 2024 cycle. Harris also has access to the $96 million remaining in the Biden campaign committee's fund. This is the important point.
Which really is one key question for a lot of people. How is she planning to use that? How is she planning to advertise? Is this more going to be trying to cater to the general election? Does she afford that kind of liberty rather than sort of catering to partisan politics more significantly the way that the other candidates potentially have? This is the reason why Kamala Harris basically is the presumed nominee. Anyone else, as you said, does face an uphill battle. Key question now will be who will be her running mate, how much pressure there'll be on that.
Absolutely. To Jonathan's point, anyone else coming in starts from zero. She has access to more than $90 million on day one if she becomes the nominee. That is huge, especially given how short this cycle is. She has name ID, but she really needs to go out there and try to connect with voters, as well as introduce her potential running mate to the rest of the nation. So that's going to be important. But also $50 million overnight from grassroots. Greg Valliere says she has now re-energized the Democrats and the base that Biden was struggling to shore up. She's starting to bring them in.
Should we go through the list of potential running mates? Let's go through the list. The list looks like this. Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, a name I know you're all familiar with. Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona. The Wall Street Journal reporting, and Anne-Marie mentioned this a little bit earlier, that she actually had talks with Shapiro as well as Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina and Andy Beshear of Kentucky just yesterday. So I think that's the list. There's like 4, 5, 6, 7 names there and maybe more elsewhere.
I would hone in into the one she spoke to yesterday. And as Terry Haines says, she really needs to go for a swing state governor. So that would put Roy Cooper and Josh Shapiro at the top of the list. Josh Shapiro, very interesting because this is where Trump wants to take the fight. This is where he's winning right now in Pennsylvania. Also yesterday, already on Twitter from Republicans talking about what she said at that debate when she wanted to be the nominee going into 2020. She would ban fracking. This is very important when it comes to Pennsylvania. So maybe Josh Shapiro makes sense. Then you look at Kentucky, someone like Andy Beshear. This is Midwest. Very much. He lives in a Republican district. Can he be someone who takes on Vance? These are interesting names, but I would say these are the top 3.
When we were playing Republican VP sweepstakes, you called it The Bachelor, right? The Bachelorette?
I may have.
Here's another season.
What's this? It's another season, precisely.
Well, OK, how do they make it not that? How do they distinguish themselves from what we saw from the Trump campaign? Does it become that, or do they solidify a ticket really quickly? There's sort of this tension that I could feel in a lot of the different interviews over the weekend. On one hand, wanting to work quickly and coalesce around someone so that it feels like that person has a mandate after an RNC that basically coronated Donald Trump and seemed to have a real degree of unity. On the flip side, how do you represent that this is a process? And it is a democratic one at that. And those are the 2 kind of competing aspects that will really determine whether we see The Bachelor on repeat or whether we see something else.
This is what Mike Novogratz was talking about, that they need to go into an open convention and make sure there is a real process in place so people feel like there was a backing and she wasn't just anointed. But they should make this like The Bachelor. What I think will infuriate Donald Trump and the Republican Party is the fact that it's going to be wall-to-wall coverage on who Kamala Harris picks. If they draw this out right before August 19th, they're going to go into this convention having a ton of media space. We already know what the Republican Party is looking at. Their ticket's done. The excitement in terms of where the news flow is coming is going to be from the Democratic side.
Who's handing out the roses? Biden, Harris? How does that work?
Nancy Pelosi.
Pelosi?
Yeah, I think so. Carry on.
Let's turn to the markets. I'm happy to carry on. Move away from that. Equity futures on the S&P positive here by about 0.5%. The dollar just a little bit weaker, slightly weaker following Biden's announcement. Kit Juckes of SocGen writing this. President Biden's decision not to stand for re-election hasn't made the outlook any clearer, but the reaction in the FX market is a reflection that the latest development improves the Democrats' chances if it changes them at all. Kit joined us now for more. Kit, I just want to start with this because I don't think it's that obvious. Are we saying that Democrats win and it means it's dollar bearish, and if Republicans win, it's dollar bullish? Is that how you see things?
I think it's how I see the bit between now and the election if it became very one-sided, in the sense that Donald Trump has been much more overt, at least in terms of wanting a stronger yen, a stronger Chinese yuan, a weaker dollar if you want. And if there are concerns about that, I think that he can get that and make it happen. Otherwise, no. The bigger, longer-term picture, frankly, is whether, you were discussing it earlier, it's whether the U.S. economy is slowing from a really, really fast rate to have something that looks like the mid-1990s, where you might get a cut, but then you're going to get a hike. Then you might get another cut, another hike, and 5 years later, you get a peak in the dollar, or whether we're back to 1985 or 2002, and the U.S. economy is going to slow some, and the Fed's going to cut, and the dollar's going to go down a long way. We don't know the answer to that, whoever's president, and neither of them is going to be putting up taxes and cutting spending dramatically, unless I've missed the scoop badly. So it's that the economy will determine. But in the period between now and the election, definitely there was a sense that Trump is putting policies in place which would tend to be sending the yen higher, for example, and are intended to weaken the dollar in some form.
Kit, I appreciate the difficulty in trying to analyze basically a black box that is getting darker and darker by the day. Lori Calvasina was explaining how sort of difficult it is to get your hands around and how everyone just wants to look at policy. Has there been any concrete policies that this year, depending on who would win, would really change the trajectory from a dollar trade that a lot of people just assumed would be much stronger with Trump, but kind of has been range-bound over the past couple of weeks?
No, not very much. That's part of the issue. And in a sense, we look at the economy and, we had this run of negative data, negative surprises in the Bloomberg Surprise Index. And that's just bounced a little bit now. And that's what's determining it, is what kind of cycle it is. I think within the election as well, we must remember that it depends what kind of Congress the president, next one, has with them. If you have a completely free reign as president, it's very different from if, on the one hand, you've got a president who's inclined to increase spending, and on the other, you'd have one who's inclined to cut taxes, and neither of them can get it done if they don't have control of the whole program. So that part of it is still completely uncertain. So I think that's why my starting point is we get a gut reaction, but we also have to admit that the starting point is the strongest dollar we've seen in years, and so there's a vulnerability. I'm not looking at dollar yen at 120 and thinking, could it go down a bit, up a bit? I'm looking at dollar yen still in the 150s. I'm looking at euro dollar still under 110. So I think at the margin, certainly, if this becomes a story of policies that aren't intended to strengthen the dollar, then you might get a weaker dollar before the election.
Kit, we know Donald Trump says the U.S. has a currency problem, but not a single Republican at the RNC was able to really outline for me how they would fix it, how they would actually weaken it. What could he do in the first few months that would actually weaken the dollar?
He could appoint a Treasury Secretary who would agree coordinated intervention with the Japanese, whose failure to get the yen to strengthen has been related to the fact they got no cooperation from the U.S. So it's hard to see what you could concretely do to strengthen the euro, other than give your full backing to supporting Ukraine and so forth. To be quite honest, it's not hard to see how you could strengthen the yen if you turned what is that the Japanese trying to strengthen their currency into a bilateral, multilateral program to strengthen the yen. That would strengthen the Chinese yuan, the Australian dollar, probably the New Zealand dollar. That the whole region's currencies probably would start coming back if you took dollar yen down to 140, say. So that's the piece I can see. The European side of all of this, much less obvious. Europe needs more growth. That's that simple.
Hey, Kit. Good to hear from you, sir. Kit Juckes there of SocGen on the FX market. I know it feels like a lifetime ago, but it was literally last week we published that interview with Donald Trump, the former president, in Bloomberg Business Week. I think the headline of the last week still in the FX market is the former president believes we have a currency problem, which is why it's less obvious to me what these individuals actually mean to foreign exchange. I think there is a consensus out there, and it existed before we published that piece, and it's based on policy. Republican win, tariffs, inflationary policy, strong dollar. Democratic win, continuity, weaker dollar, rest of the world starts to improve. But if the sitting president starts to turn around and say, we have a currency problem, Does it change that story?
This is the reason why there's a high degree of uncertainty. But as Kit Juckes said, the starting point is a very strong dollar. So maybe people will use that as an excuse to take chips off the table or whatever cliche you want to say. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really change things because the economic policy, the Treasury Secretary will be really what drives that.
The euro just a little bit stronger, just short of 109 at about 108.90. Let's give an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Donald Trump has posted on Truth Social shortly after Biden's announcement. He used the opportunity to continue to go after Biden, calling him unfit to serve. Trump had addressed Harris in that Business Week story you were talking about, John. He previewed his strategy against her, saying, quote, "I don't think it would make much difference. I would define her in a very similar manner that I defined Biden." China caught investors by surprise with interest rate cuts overnight. The country is hoping to prop up growth because there had been a notable lack of short-term stimulus in last week's major Communist Party meeting. Chinese banks followed the move about an hour later by lowering their main benchmark lending rates, making it less costly to borrow for mortgages and other loans. And another eventful Grand Prix. Oscar Piastri won his first F1 race at the Hungarian circuit, securing a McLaren 1-2 with teammate Lando Norris finishing runner-up. The result came after an awkward back and forth between the team and its drivers. Norris finally obeyed team orders and let Piastri pass. Now, it was a race dominated by heated radio messages, where Max Verstappen's engineer called his over-the-air complaints childish. The Red Bull driver ultimately finished fifth, with Mercedes' Lewis Hamilton rounding out the podium in third. And that's your brief, John.
McLaren sounded like the Democratic Party over the weekend, telling Lando to step aside, and let Piastri win. Do you notice that? Felt the same way. Up next on the programme, passing the torch to Kamala Harris.
Donald Trump were to win in November, he will continue to sell out working families. Donald Trump has openly vowed, if re-elected, that he'll be a dictator on day one.
The conversation up next. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance. Starting the week in the right way for the equity market bulls. Equity futures positive here by 0.5%. Bonds rally just a little bit. We're down a basis point or two on a 10-year, 422.33. Under surveillance this morning, passing the torch to Kamala Harris.
Donald Trump were to win in November, he will continue to sell out working families. Donald Trump has openly vowed, if re-elected, that he'll be a dictator on day one. Joe Biden and I trust women. And women trust all of us to fight for their most fundamental freedoms.
So here's the latest. Democratic donations surging beyond $50 million in the hours after President Joe Biden ended his re-election campaign. Vice President Kamala Harris moving forward with the endorsement of President Biden and the $96 million already in their campaign's account. The financial boost giving Harris the edge over any potential challengers for the Democratic nomination. Bloomberg campaign finance reporter Bill Allison joins us now for more. Bill, let's follow the money. You follow the money every single day. How do those numbers stack up with what the former president, Donald Trump's been able to achieve?
Donald Trump has had an amazing run of fundraising since that, actually since, he was indicted and the historic conviction in the New York courtroom. I mean, he raised about $58 million that day online alone. He's had a number of people who are signing up to support his campaign. We've reported that Elon Musk has pledged to put $45 million a month into a super PAC to help him get out the vote. So Donald Trump is doing financially very, very well. His campaign and the Republican Party started July with about $285 million in the bank. That's $45 million more than Joe Biden and the Democrats had.
Bill, what does it mean for Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket? We know that means she has access to the $96 million in Biden's war chest. But what kind of new donations could we see?
Well, there has been, a huge jump in online donations to Act Blue. We don't know exactly where those donations are going, but I think it's a pretty good guess that a lot of them are going either to the president, to her ticket, or to the DNC, which supports her. Democratic donors were on the sidelines for most of the month of July. They were talking about holding back $90 million that was going to go into the main super PAC that was going to support Joe Biden. Now we expect some of that money to come loose. And, Democratic donors were very, very uncomfortable with donating to Joe Biden, who they weren't sure could finish out another 4-year term. And now I think that what we're going to see is that they're going to be, energized, and we're going to see like a lot more money coming into Democratic coffers.
Okay, so she's what everyone is guessing is going to be the nominee, given the endorsement from the sitting president. But what if it's not her? What if it is a governor? What does that mean for terms of their access to some of the money that the DNC and Joe Biden has built up?
Well, the campaign money, I mean, basically, the only thing you could do with that is you could either donate it to, if another candidate were to win, they can't just take over that the campaign's money. That is, for this particular set of candidates, now just Kamala Harris. But so that money basically would be lost to the party unless whoever is running the campaign were to donate it to either the Democratic National Committee campaign. I'm sorry?
Carry on.
Oh, sorry. Campaigns can give an unlimited amount of money to a political party. So all of that could go to the DNC, which could be used for the election of their candidate. It could go to an outside spending group like a super PAC. So there would be options. That money wouldn't be entirely lost if somebody else were to get the nomination.
Bill, we apologize for that technical difficulty. We will get that remedied. We are also seeing that Joe Biden spent 93% of his money that he raised in June. And it raises a question, how did he spend the money? And how will it change in terms of how the money will be spent under, presumably, Kamala Harris?
So far, I mean, and I think this is one of the things that's a little bit lost. Democrats have spent so far about $450 million. That includes Joe Biden. That includes the Democratic National Committee. And all of that money really is to elect Joe Biden, to make the case for him. And that money can't be recouped. So in some ways, while they have, $240 million that they started June with, or July with, and obviously they've been spending a lot of that on television. And I think they booked $35 million in TV time in July alone for Joe Biden from the campaign. So they got to change gears pretty quickly. And obviously they'll be cutting spots for Harris and making the case for her. And if there are other people who get in, there are some, I don't know that you necessarily need to be spending a whole lot of money. It's not like you're running in a primary in New Hampshire or Iowa or, or on Super Tuesday. So I think candidates who do want to challenge and get in could certainly raise, $10 million pretty quickly and use that to, basically to try to influence the delegates and get their message out.
Just quickly here, Bill, where is the money coming from? How much is coming from big business versus smaller individuals?
So with, the party money is largely coming from big donors. But, this... as the Act Blue money shows, that's usually small dollar donors, not always, but, so I think that there's more grassroots enthusiasm now than there has been. And, all of this money is donated by individuals who work, but some of them do indeed work for big businesses. We just won't know until we see the campaign finance reports, which next come out on August 20th. So we'll see who's donating to her and if anybody else gets into their campaigns.
Hey, Bill, appreciate the update. Bill Allison there of Bloomberg on the latest campaign financing effort. The pressure on President Biden to drop out from within his own party, from what they were seeing in the polls, and what was happening with donors and the money. Just to give you an example, just an idea of how quickly the money was drying up. This was Bill's lead paragraph in his story over the weekend. Before his Sunday announcement that he was leaving the presidential race, Joe Biden's beleaguered campaign entered July with $96 million cash on hand after a spending spree last month that depleted about 93% of the money that it raised in June. That's how quickly the money was going.
And how it was not being replenished, as you point out, raises this issue of the $50 million plus or minus that was brought into the campaign in one day, basically, in the hours after Joe Biden stepped aside. Raises a question, how much of that was on the sidelines waiting for some change to take place before coming back into the race?
When we started the programme this morning, our first question was, have we dealt with this? Is there a process here? Of course there's a process. Can this party get behind one candidate? Or will we see a challenge? Senator Joe Manchin on US TV just moments ago, people pushing in the direction of me running?
Well, potentially these are some donors who want to see a very centrist candidate or potentially just want to see an open convention, and they're going to go with someone who basically feels like he has the chutzpah to throw his name in the ring. We need to note Manchin is an independent. He first needs to become a Democrat again and be welcomed back into the party in order to get the nod, which doesn't look like it's going to happen, but maybe he wants something.
The second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance up next with Wei Li of BlackRock, Henrietta Treyz of Veda Partners, Jim Bianco of Bianco Research, and Thierry Wizman of Macquarie from New York. This is Bloomberg.
She's got problems there, but she's very, very strong on the social issue part.
Already you see so many endorsements coming in. I think the money will move immediately to support her.
Like all vice presidents, she polls pretty close to the president. But people are going to take a very excited, fresh look.
She needs to show that she is an individual apart from Joe Biden.
In this case, we've never seen really anything like what the Democrats are going through, but they have actually a wonderful opportunity to reset this race.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
We've got a very different race now. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning for our audience worldwide. The second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now with a snapshot of equity futures this morning. On the S&P 500, firmer by 0.5%. The outperformance on the Nasdaq, we're up by 0.9.
And climbing as we go through the morning as people reassess what Kamala Harris's entrance to the race mean. Is this a sort of question around how much the down ballot votes can really go to one party or another? Is this going to be the gridlock that people were hoping for that might tie people's hands? Or is this a Kamala Harris that's more friendly to big tech than either the Democratic Party aside from her or Donald Trump?
The Democratic Party has been a mess now for a number of weeks, ever since that debate at the end of June. Can they actually unite and get behind one candidate and move forward? Once they've achieved that, then we can have a real discussion about what the difference is in the policies of Harris and Trump.
And that's exactly what the Trump campaign is already trying to say. There's not a lot of distance, we heard from the Trump campaign saying, between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. So they're going to want to paint her and attach her to the incumbent, Joe Biden. But we have had a groundswell of support for Kamala Harris overnight. Governors, those governors that many were saying could potentially be individuals to take the top of the ticket, are backing her. We're waiting on some few key names: Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries. This is the leadership, if you will, from Congress. And also, Jonathan mentioned earlier, former President Barack Obama. The Clintons came out and endorsed her. Obama is waiting. But we have seen in the past, Obama likes to wait. He's always said he doesn't want to put his thumb on the scale because they want this to actually be a process, because people are already being critical of the Democratic Party, saying this isn't a process if you're just going to anoint Kamala Harris to be the top of the ticket.
A lot of this has spurred a lot of discussion of unprecedented, and there were notes overnight talking about the volatility that this would sort of create in markets because of how unprecedented this really is. We have seen the opposite this morning, and Laura Calvasina, I think, really did a wonderful job explaining why. If anything, this might be more certainty. For the past couple of weeks, everyone was waking up with the question, has Joe Biden stepped aside in the race yet? We have an answer. And you know what? The person who would follow up is more of a continuation candidate, not necessarily a new candidate.
So let's sit on the week ahead. We've got earnings for you. Alphabet tomorrow. We're here from Tesla too. We've got data for you. PC on Friday. And then you've got this. All of a sudden, we start to watch this. An address today from the Vice President, Lisa.
And this comes at the same time that you're hearing all the other noise and that Joe Biden supposedly is going to speak on Wednesday. Sort of interesting that he's going to wait that long, whether it's COVID, et cetera. How much can Kamala Harris win the sort of hearts and minds, if you want to go to some of the political speak, of the electorate now that it's not just a name, it's not just an age, 59 versus 81, but it is actually a candidate in her own right who has run before but has a bit more experience under belt.
Let's turn to the price action. Equity futures here positive by 0.5% on the S&P 500. In the bond market, yields a little lower by a basis point or two on a 10-year, 422.33. Coming up this hour, we'll catch up with Wei Li of BlackRock as stocks come off their their worst week since April. Henrietta Treyz of Veda Partners as President Biden bows out, and Jim Bianco of Bianco Research as traders reevaluate the Trump trade. We begin with our top story. President Biden making his exit, quitting the 2024 presidential race and endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris. The decision follows weeks of pressure from party leaders to drop out. The election fewer than 4 months away. Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove joins us now for more. Josh, great to catch up with you this morning, sir. Let's just take a step back. What happened in Delaware over the weekend, the hours that led up to that statement that dropped out on Twitter at 1:46 Eastern Time? No Oval Office address, just a letter. What happened?
Good morning. Yeah, it looks like he was huddling with some of his senior aides. These are people that were sort of pushing him the other way. At least that's what the reporting indicated. Steve Ricchetti, Mike Donnellan, among others. Biden has a very close circle of allies, and it looks like they more or less just saw the writing on the wall as recently as, you know, that morning and the night before. All signs were that Joe Biden planned to stay in this race and that his family wanted him to do that. And so a real 180 here. And a lot of the reporting now is sort of what sort of was the drumbeat to lead up to that. Nancy Pelosi seems to have been a pretty influential figure in that, but the pace and the velocity of the last, 24 hours has been remarkable. I mean, even after that announcement, we still haven't heard from Joe Biden, in the flesh, by the way.
Well, exactly, Josh. A written letter and not verbal remarks. Why? Why did the nation not see the president of the United States, the sitting president? Why did adversaries and allies not see the sitting president in focus with remarks explaining why he's stepping down and not seeking re-election?
He's still in COVID treatment. I don't really know beyond that. I'm headed to Delaware in an hour, Anne-Marie. I'll have an update for you as soon as I can to check on it. But yeah, we're watching to see what he'll say this week. And this is a tricky balancing act for Harris, right? She's going to run sort of away from Biden on certain issues if they become sort of political baggage. And now we've got this sort of juggling act, and it's going to be an interesting one to watch. I'll say, I think right now, 3 o'clock, our editors at Bloomberg yesterday afternoon were asking, what are the rules? How is this going to shake out? What surprised me yesterday was just the absolute speed that Harris is consolidating support. The notion that this is going to be a contested primary is vanishing by the second right now. So with all due respect to Senator Manchin, it looks like this is absolutely Harris's to lose. It looks like it won't be particularly close, although anything can change. And so it's going to be full speed ahead, it looks like, going in. And of course, part of that is because the campaign has already flipped over to her name and she's got the money behind it.
Josh, Joe Biden is remaining president until the election, even after the election, until handling the presidency over. A lot of people, including particularly Republican House Speaker Johnson, has talked about his resignation, what this means for the next few months. How much talk is there about that? Has that been fully shut down? Is this sort of move forward ahead? Or is there this risk of the legitimacy going forward for the remaining months?
There are some Democrats who will tell you that they would, in an ideal world, prefer that Harris be the president running for re-election as the incumbent. In other words, Joe Biden step aside. But practically, there is just zero pressure, it seems right now, publicly, at least in the party, for him to do that. This is Republicans calling for it, not Democrats. It does not look like it would get to a critical mass that would make Joe Biden have to step aside. And remember, the theory of the case only like a couple of weeks ago, or even a few days ago for Joe Biden, was that his presidency is doing great and he wants to, quote, finish the job. And so it looks like he'll start to do that here in the coming months. We're going to be interested, and one of the big targets this week is learning, okay, well, he's only got a few months left. He's now to borrow from Kamala Harris, unburdened by what has been, or what, he doesn't necessarily have to worry about the election. Does that change what he does? Maybe on Israel and Gaza, does that put him in a different position? We've been watching for presidential actions on things like the U.S. Steel acquisition. A lot of balls in the air right now that Biden might still have to deal with. And if he's not running for re-election, that could change the calculus.
What can be? Josh Wingrove of Bloomberg, thank you, sir. We'll catch up with you when you get down to Delaware. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Wei Li of BlackRock joins us now for more. Wei Li, we've seen the moves in markets over the last few weeks into small caps, thinking about the banks and energy, and thinking less about maybe some of the big tech players. The point that you and the team have made over at BlackRock over the last week in your mid-year outlook, it feels to me that it's like just stick with what's been working. These AI themes are powerful and they're not going away, and you can focus on that and ignore the politics. Can we do that this morning?
Good morning. Well, it's been a very busy few weeks, both in terms of political development, and now we're entering the earnings season. I think it's really important, difficult, but important to cut through the day-to-day noise and really focus on the fundamental picture. And the fundamental picture remains that the earnings growth strength remains quite strong. And within that, tech is still expected to deliver the ballpark of U.S. equity market earnings growth. Yes, indeed, small cap had staged quite an impressive rebound. We think that that has been catalyzed by markets extrapolating recent macro trend, which is inflation is falling. And that led to markets getting excited about rate cuts. But taking a step back, again, cutting through the day-to-day noise and resisting the temptation to extrapolate near-term momentum of macro development, we're still looking at an environment of high for longer. So in terms of the discount rates that we will use to discount future cash flow, we're still talking about a rate that is higher than pre-pandemic levels. And when it comes to earnings, small cap, for over 1 year now, they didn't deliver any earnings growth. For this ongoing earnings season, they're expected to recover a little bit, but still really lagging the broader picture. So all of that just to say there has been a technical rebound, likely driven by sentiment positioning for small cap, but we're not chasing that momentum because that rebound is not supported by fundamentals.
I've heard growth, I've heard Fed, I've heard earnings, I've heard no politics in anything you've just said, which is somewhat refreshing for, I think, for a lot of people. Does this just basically mean ignore politics and go with those three pillars of what the economic data indicates, what the Fed does, and what earnings show?
I absolutely think politics are important, but it's important to cut through the day-to-day noise and focus on the bigger picture as it relates to politics. So when we think about kind of the potential scenarios, no matter who gets in the White House, no matter who wins the election, we're still talking about an environment where U.S. fiscal deficit is expected to stay very large at unprecedented levels because neither candidate is talking about reducing the deficit on a sustained basis. And that together with the potential for protectionist policy, with the potential for stricter immigration, we're talking about high for longer, especially also in the context of mega forces shaping the environment. So I think portfolios really need to think about positioning for higher rates compared with pre-pandemic levels. Yes, we're likely going to see the Fed starting to cut rates in September, but we don't think they can go very far because of the underlying inflationary pressure. So positioning for high for longer for portfolio is an important takeaway, even as we think about read across from politics too.
Wei Li, you say you want to lean into the risk, but I look back at the year 2000 when the market sold off some 8% from the time of the election to year end. What happens on November 6th, 7th, 8th, if potentially there is a contested election?
I think right now everything is kind of highly uncertain, and recent development potentially even adds to that uncertainty. So I wouldn't kind of speculate way ahead of time, you know, what could happen in later this year. Again, I really want to stress the importance of kind of analyzing outcomes along the lines of policy. What does it mean for fiscal policy? What does it mean for trade, foreign policy? What does it mean for the transition, the low carbon transition? What does it mean for immigration? This is how we're thinking about analyzing election outcomes. And all of that at this juncture, what we can say with greater certainty is looking through all the scenarios, we're all talking about potentially higher inflationary pressure. We're talking about potentially higher rates, and that's what we can position for right now. From now until later this year, we're also talking about right now a pretty kind of a quieter environment because we're entering summer, lighter liquidity environment. And this type of backdrop, I would say, potentially can mean exacerbated market moves, both on the upside and downside, and embracing for potential liquidity-driven market volatility is something that we need to kind of be positioned for. And at the same time, one more thing I will flag to your radar, which is that we're talking about Japan. inflation likely re-accelerating. We're talking about end of July, Bank of Japan event being really a live event, their meeting being a live event. So far, a weaker yen has been a popular funding currency for a lot of the popular trades, things that have done well. So if we're talking about a reversal, we have seen yen strengthening for 3 weeks now. If we're talking about a reversal of this kind of funding trade, we could see some unexplained kind of moves of the popular trades, especially against the backdrop of lighter liquidity during summer. And that's something that we're on the watch out for. But as we cut through all of these potential kind of triggers for market volatility, the bottom line is focus on fundamentals. We're going through earnings season right now. Focus on what is delivering earnings growth. And the AI theme is still expected to do most of the heavy lifting for earnings growth. We're talking about tech expected to deliver 18% year-on-year for Q2 earnings growth versus US ex-tech only expected to deliver 2%. So focus on where the drivers of revenue is, and that's how we're thinking about positioning for summer too.
Wei, thank you. Wei Li there of BlackRock, looking for a quieter summer. I'll take that. I think we'll all take that. Quiet summer.
Quieter when it comes to just the amount of volumes. What I got from her was stop putting a narrative in every big market move, because frankly, sometimes there isn't, and there's a lot of noise. Cut through the noise, strip out the noise, look through the noise, longer term. And that, I think, is what a lot of traders are trying to do. It can be very hard. It's very noisy.
Translate. Ignore the politics. I think that was the line coming from Wei Li of BlackRock just there. No. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Here's your Bloomberg brief with Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Berkshire Hathaway has sold off another chunk of BYD. Now Warren Buffett's stake in the Chinese EV maker is under 5%. It was more than 20% 2 years ago. And that investment had returned Berkshire a 2,000% gain, but began reducing its holdings in late 2022. The less than 5% position means that Berkshire Hathaway is now no longer obligated to disclose sales. Deutsche Bank is bidding to become one of Wall Street's main European rivals for serving America's ultra-rich. The head of the bank's U.S. wealth unit plans to add as many as a dozen senior private bankers this year. Deutsche Bank reports earnings on Wednesday. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is heading to Washington this week. Netanyahu will meet with President Joe Biden on Tuesday, address Congress on Wednesday, and then meet Kamala Harris on Thursday. Ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas are still ongoing. The visit also comes in the shadow of Biden's decision to exit the campaign. And that's your brief. John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Up next on the program, starting the search for a vice president.
They need a geographic balance ticket, and they need frankly, I think they need a swing state governor on the ticket. That strikes me kind of as Captain Obvious.
That conversation up next, live from New York City this morning. Good morning. The opening bout to kick off a brand new trading week, a little more than 2 hours away. Equity futures going into it positive by 0.5% on the S&P. Clear out performance on the Nasdaq, attempted to bounce back from a pretty tough, rough down week. Last week, the Nasdaq 100 up by 0.8%. Under surveillance this morning, starting the search for a vice president.
They need a geographic balance ticket, and they need frankly, I think they need a swing state governor on the ticket. That strikes me kind of as Captain Obvious. They've shown weakness in the swing states. It's capturable. They need somebody that actually kind of knows that ground and can speak center speak more than anything else, and it has a background of being successful with centrist voters.
So here's the latest this morning. Vice President Kamala Harris reportedly speaking to potential candidates to join a new ticket for the Democratic Party. The Wall Street Journal reporting Harris had calls with Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper, and Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear. Henrietta Treyz of Veda Partners writing this: the enormity of Biden's decision to step down and the drama that is about to ensue within the Democratic Party means all eyes and media attention will be on the palace intrigue process and the hunt for the next VP. Henrietta joins us now for more. Henrietta, I want to turn to the process. I want to talk with you about what the next month looks like going into August 19th at the DNC in Chicago. What are the key dates before that? What does this process look like?
Thanks for having me. The process starts around July 29th. There are going to be some behind-the-scenes rules committee and platform committee meetings before then. But around July 29th into August 1st, you start getting the delegates lined up, having an understanding of how they're going to vote. August 7th are some critical dates, along with August 9th. And then we kick off into the convention when all of this will have been sorted and we'll know how the delegates are going to vote, whether the superdelegates are going to need to weigh in, which would be on a second round. And then the convention itself occurs. Donald Trump announced his vice presidential running mate on the Monday before the RNC launched. I think we should expect a similar kind of flow from the Democrats this year. And obviously, as I wrote yesterday, the palace intrigue around who it might be, which state is going to get the nod, which electoral college map is what the Democrats are going to be working on. I suspect it's going to be a North Carolina, Georgia heavy focus versus just a blue wall or Rust Belt focus. And then Mark Kelly in Arizona, as I was just speaking with Tom Keene in Surveillance on, is a perfect example of somebody else who could help expand the map where Biden was losing ground considerably over the last couple months.
So is it your understanding that they will hold a virtual roll call vote before August 19th?
That is the plan right now. That has been what is scheduled. The virtual component comes from a string of things, all of which are basically expired now, including some issues with the Ohio ballot. And the dates have all been moved, sometimes very publicly so, even with Majority Leader Schumer weighing in and saying, hey, don't you dare try to pull this forward. We're going to take all the time we need to get to this convention and have the delegates vote live if we need to. But the roll call vote virtually is still scheduled to proceed, as far as I'm aware, in those early August days.
So let's talk about the VPs, Roy Cooper, Josh Shapiro, Andy Beshear. The names John mentioned that Kamala Harris, got on the phone with yesterday, according to the Wall Street Journal. What do those three men bring to the ticket?
I mean, knowledge of the states that the Democratic Party needs the most. I think there's a lot of merit to considering that we might be hearkening back to a time when the vice presidential pick and the name recognition they had on the ground in a key state is really critical to someone who's launching their campaign 105 days out from the election. Many folks, myself included, for the last several years have been saying that the vice presidential pick doesn't really matter from a geographical standpoint. Think Mike Pence in Indiana or even J.D. Vance in Ohio. Trump has got those states locked up. It shouldn't be too much of a concern. For the Democrats, and particularly for Kamala Harris, who has much lower name recognition than even Donald Trump, and all of those candidates that are listed there, name recognition is going to be paramount to setting the message about who they are. That's already higher in those states. So for North Carolina with Roy Cooper, Shapiro in Pennsylvania, those all make sense to start with somebody who's already got an operation on the ground.
Henrietta, one of the big reasons why the vice presidential pick is going to be so important is people are wondering whether Kamala Harris is a true continuation candidate, basically picking up the torch from Joe Biden, or whether her platform is going to differ somewhat substantially in certain key areas. How much do you think that we're going to get a sense of this? What direction do you think she's going to go in?
You know, I'll be really honest. Next year, we're going to write a tax bill. So we could talk about Kamala Harris's position on taxes, but frankly, she wasn't on any of the relevant committees to be a tax policy expert, and she doesn't have the authority via the Constitution to write the tax bill in the first place. If you're focused on, what is the platform going to be, call up the House Democratic Ways and Means Committee members, call up Richie Neal, call up their staff, and have those conversations and see what their position is. Helpfully, they already wrote this bill, and they published it several years ago. And it is, signed, sealed, delivered from the Democratic Party, ready to go to Kamala Harris, where that's the platform she's going to pursue on the tax front. With regards to climate and AI and emerging tech, I suspect the trade policy will be very similar to President Biden's. I wonder how many of the same USTR folks would stay on for a second Kamala Harris term. A lot of these agencies, I would say the Department of Commerce, for example, have built these robust platforms just in the last couple of years since things like the CHIPS Act, the infrastructure bill have passed, the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of work that those same people still have to do. I suspect there wouldn't be a lot of turnover, and they'll continue their agenda.
Henrietta, this was great. Henrietta Treyz there, Veda Partners, on the process over the next month and the odds that Kamala Harris can get this done. Let's just sit on this. Is the energy going to come back to the party? Based on the reaction of the party in the last 24 hours? Maybe. Do you get rid of the age issue? Absolutely. Does it change anything? If we're only talking about a continuity candidate with more energy, what fundamentally does it change beyond enthusiasm of the base? This is Isaac Boltanski of BTIG this morning. Our foundational view remains the same. We continue to believe it will be a close race, and we maintain our view that Trump is the slight favorite.
The key will be down ballot. That is the reason why people are thinking maybe this causes a split Congress more likely than necessarily the top of the ticket.
We'll keep building on this. Coming up next on the program, Jim Bianco of Bianco Research as traders rethink the so-called Trump trade. That's next. You're watching Bloomberg. Sneak peek at the price action. This is what it looks like. The S&P 500 up by 0.5%. The Nasdaq 100 up by 0.8. The Russell up by 1/3. The small caps underperformed. The small caps outperformed last week. Listen to this. These were the scores last week. The Nasdaq 100 down by 4% almost on the week. The small caps up by 1.7. We're talking about almost 6 percentage points, Lisa, of outperformance on the small caps last week. So that gap we're closing today is like this big compared to the gap of last week.
So, and just sort of that extends what we've seen since June 27th. Just to put this into perspective, banks, smaller banks in particular, are up more than 10% since that time. They have been the big outperformers with the presumption that Donald Trump will consolidate not only his base, but others as well to win the election.
David George of Baird joining us later on in the program in about 45 minutes. He thinks you should fade that rally in the banks that Lisa just described. Switch of the board, turn from equities to bonds, leave behind that 4-day losing streak on the S&P 500 and get into the 2-year. 451.70. It's actually an interesting week ahead. No Fed speak, and I have to say the Fed speak that we have had over the last week was pretty consistent. We're getting closer to a rate cut, but we're not there yet. It's about the economic data. Retail sales last week better, jobless claims worse. This week another round of claims, Lisa, and PCE on Friday.
Another view on consumer spending at a time where we have a number of companies coming out and explaining they definitely do see softening consumer demand. This is the key issue that people are looking at. You hear one markets participant after another coming out and saying, we don't want to focus on the noise. How do they strip out the noise? How do they focus on the policy when we don't understand the policy? They say either candidate, regardless of who it will be, will cause the deficit to be increased, so higher benchmark rates, and faces off with the fundamental economy, which is softening, but not soft yet. That really is what's going to dictate a lot of some of the trajectory. There also are bond auctions this week, which we haven't really talked about.
What have we got? What's coming up?
We've got $69 billion of 2-year notes coming up tomorrow. We've got $70 billion of 5-year notes on Wednesday, $44 billion of 7-year notes on Thursday. The reason why people care is because ultimately fiscal policy can't change that much that quickly. And a lot of it does matter on the composition of Congress. So people are looking to this. We heard Wei Li basically avoid any political discussion to talk about instead basically the bond options.
I loved how Wei navigated that in the last 30 minutes or so. Cut through the noise. But politics, cut through the noise. Cut through the noise. It's like that repeatedly. Let's turn to foreign exchange. The euro just a little stronger, dollar weaker today. Against the euro, we stand at about 108.87. Against the yen stronger again. Dollar yen down by about 0.4% in the yen's favour. 156.80 is where dollar yen is this morning. Under surveillance this morning, endorsements pouring in for Kamala Harris. Bill and Hillary Clinton, Senator Elizabeth Warren and California Governor Gavin Newsom among the notable Democrats backing her, but former President Barack Obama falling short of endorsement, saying he believes Democrats will create a process from which an outstanding nominee emerges. That was notable yesterday afternoon.
It was notable, but likely what you see from the former president, Barack Obama, is that he doesn't want to put his thumb on the scale. He said this about 4 years ago. So I would say that he's just waiting for the process to play out, and then he's going to come with his full-fledged endorsement. What was interesting, though, is all the governors that everyone was talking about could be potential tops of tickets. Shapiro, Newsom, Whitmer, even Phil Murphy in New Jersey, they're all coming out and getting behind Kamala Harris. So it does feel like there isn't this infighting with the Democratic Party that many thought would happen if Joe Biden dropped down. A lot of that has to the fact that he endorsed her 30 minutes later, and now she has access to his cash.
All I can say is, currently on Predicted, Michelle Obama has about a 6% chance of running as a Democratic candidate. So anyone who's saying this is a conspiracy theory to get Michelle in, first of all, it's sort of clear that she doesn't want it. And second of all, it seems like that's not necessarily the likely outcome being predicted. I will just say the idea of a contested primary, or basically a contested delegate kind of race, is one key question of how do you create legitimacy at a time when the candidate was pushed out, the closest ever to an election for a sitting president. That is unprecedented. How do you then create this feeling and counter criticism that this really does create kind of a clubby sort of inevitability of her election?
Undermining democracy. At the same time, you're claiming to be the poster child for it.
Well, some people would argue that the polls suggested that they would really want a bigger primary season, and 80% of people were hoping that Joe Biden did step down. So what is sort of the popular will is a good question. That said, sort of ringing a little bit hollow for some people.
81 million people voted for her attached to Joe Biden as the VP candidate when they won election in 2020. And I think that's what the Democrats are going to say. She was part of that ticket. You're voting for a president and a vice president who could assume that role.
Jamie Dimon got a mention yesterday afternoon on the special.
I heard that, yeah.
None of us bring it up. Honestly, it's always the political ones that bring up this stuff.
So how much is this a desire to see him in office? How much is it just that he's got a lot of name recognition? You know, Ginny Zaino did say, because I'm on Bloomberg, I'll mention Jamie Dimon because it seems like the de facto way that you have to go when you talk about politics.
These are names that just get thrown around all the time. Let's turn to this. Donald Trump responding to President Biden's exit, posting on Truth Social the following. Shouldn't the Republican Party be reimbursed for fraud in that everybody around Joe, including the doctors and the fake news media, knew he was not capable of running for or being president? Framing matters. There are three different conversations taking place. There's the conversation Republicans want to have, and it's its fitness for office. And we've all heard the question, if he can't campaign, can he govern? There's a conversation the public's been having for a number of weeks, and you see it in the polls going against the president. And there's a conversation the Democrats have been having. And it's not been about whether he can govern for the next 4.5 years. It's about whether he can win in November. And that's what they're focused on, winning in November. And if you look at the letter, the president didn't exactly come out and say, look, my cognitive ability is not going to allow me to campaign in November and ultimately govern for another 4.5 years. They're trying to frame this in a very, very different way for obvious reasons.
Yeah, obviously, because the Republicans are immediately coming out with the pushback, and they're also going to try to paint Kamala Harris complicit in what the public views as a deterioration of Joe Biden's health. I go back to a poll CNN and SSRS did a few months ago. 55% of Americans rate and that Trump's presidency was a success, versus 39% think that Biden's presidency was a success. So all they really need to do, the Republicans, what you're going to continuously see them to do, and President Trump did this at the RNC. He kept talking about this current administration. He, by accidentally, slipped and mentioned Biden's name. He was not supposed to, but he kept saying the current administration because he was preparing for this potential moment.
You know, I think there are genuine and legitimate questions, though, about the president's health right now. I think we've got to ask, where is he? It is Monday morning. Yesterday afternoon, you pushed out a statement at 1:46 p.m. Eastern Time in Delaware. You don't hear from the president. You're told that maybe at some point this week you might get an address from the president of the United States to the nation. Still this morning, no real update. It is very, very strange to have a decision like this and then have nothing afterwards whatsoever and not hear from the president himself. We understand, of course, he got COVID last week and he's self-isolating, but he's still got people around him that stayed with him in Delaware over the weekend. It's very strange we haven't heard from the sitting president in the last 24 hours.
A lot of people are wondering why. Is it simply because he's sick and coughing? Is it because he isn't that into this and doesn't really want to throw his heart into it? There are going to be a lot of these arguments. What I find interesting is which one the Republicans are going to coalesce around. Because, frankly, we've heard a lot thrown at this, whether it's this idea of disenfranchisement, whether it's this idea of, questions around why this hasn't been revealed earlier. What are they going to coalesce around at a time when they have to sort of jigger the playbook for the Trump campaign?
I think it's a good point you bring up, Jonathan. There's really no excuse for the president of the United States, given the fact that he ran an entire campaign from his house in Delaware when there was COVID and people were locked up. He could have got on a Zoom. He could have had a camera crew come in, set up in his house when he was isolating in a different room. There are ways the president of the United States could have presented himself to the American people and give this address over the weekend instead of this letter, which, to be honest, when I saw the letter, I actually said to people, potentially, was this a hack?
Bit of news from CBS. Here's the headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal. Senator Manchin says he's not going to be the candidate for president. We were talking about whether this party would unite behind one candidate. Would there be a challenge? Manchin's name got mentioned yesterday afternoon. According to CBS, I'm not running for office.
Yeah, well, it does mean that he's actually got what he wanted, essentially, sort of this quick whirlwind that focused attention on him. What this shows is just how few potential candidates there are to run against Kamala Harris, really ultimately being the Democratic nominee.
We need to talk about this market as well. Investors rethinking the so-called Trump trade, considering whether President Biden's exit from the race boosts the odds of a Democratic victory. Treasury yields edging lower, the dollar slipping, and equity markets lifting this Monday morning. Jim Bianco of Bianco Research joins us now for more. Jim, do we need to rethink the so-called Trump trade this Monday morning?
If you assume that there was a Trump trade to begin with, yeah, you do definitely need to rethink that. Now, why do I say that? Look at what's happened in the last couple of months. Donald Trump was found guilty. That seems like 3 cycles ago. We had a debate. We had an assassination attempt. Now we've had a withdrawal. And if you look at stocks, bonds, yields, Bitcoin, you look at a chart of those over the last 3 months, show me where those events have happened, and you can't find them. So I'm not so sure at the top level there has been a Trump trade, or let's call it an election 24 trade, or that there will be one as we go forward. Now, if you want to drill down to go to the industry level or the specific stock level, yeah, there's probably some in there, highlighted by Trump media being probably the most obvious of those trades. But the reason that there isn't a Trump trade, John, you mentioned it before. Whoever wins, we're still going to have a deficit. We're still going to have high government spending. We're still going to have the same problems that we've had now. We're going to have, regardless of which candidate that we get winning in November. And that's why I think that we've kind of overstated this Trump trade.
Well, have we overstated the potential volatility then on some of the unprecedented shifts that we're seeing in this election cycle? So many different notes last night, the night before, but really highlighting last night how there was an expected volatility in the works because of some of the upending of the race. Is that a fallacy?
Well, I think what they're mistaking is that there's a Paul trade in this market going on at the same time. I know you mentioned before about the dramatic outperformance of small caps and small cap banks surging. There's a better argument to be made that that's around the potential pivot for the Fed to cut rates in September, that's what drove that trade. Let's not forget, though, that last week, too, the stock market, as you mentioned, the S&P was down 4%. So there was already volatility building in this market. And this morning, given what we saw in the second half of last week, has been very subdued. You would expect it, even without this announcement, based on what happened last week, a bigger move in this market. So I don't think there is a real big, again, I'm talking about at the top level, at the market level, or maybe at the sector level, that you've really seen this play in the market. And lastly, I'll mention something Henrietta mentioned in the previous sector. Whatever the policy is of Trump, whatever the policy is of Harris if she's the nominee, needs 218 congressmen and 51 senators to agree with it. We're not electing a monarch. We kind of forget our, 8th grade government class, that we need both of those bodies to agree with whatever that they want to do. And I think that that's really more where the markets are focused.
You mentioned that on the sector level, it could have a bigger impact. And the sector level includes one of the biggest behemoths that's driven the market rally to date, which has been big tech. And we've seen big tech get a boost in part because there is this belief that Kamala Harris will be more friendly to big tech with certain types of tariff policies, et cetera, that she can do unilaterally than some of the other potential candidates. How much do you view that as having credence and having legs?
Well, I think there is a little bit more there, and especially if you were to focus on Tesla. For whatever reason, Tesla seems to be a stock that is kind of like a Trump trade stock. The stock was up 45% in 11 days after the debate. And because Elon Musk has been so tied with Donald Trump, he's giving him $45 million a month now for the rest of the election cycle. So, yeah, that's helped to push all of the Magnificent Seven stocks higher and some of the other stocks as well. But even if you were to take Tesla out, yeah, I think that there's probably more of a trade there. But not even there, I would say it's not as much as everybody thought. But there is more there than there is at the top level.
But, Jim, can we sit on Tesla for a second? Isn't this a company that benefits from what the Biden-Harris administration has done when it comes to EV subsidies across the United States?
You could argue that, and then you can look at the stock price, and for months and months and months, it went down, down, down until June 28th, and it took off and went up 45%. So, I mean, that's an argument, a rational argument that makes sense, but the way that the stock is traded. Look, we're in a meme stock world anyway. And so the way that this stock trades is it is starting to trade like Trump media as a meme stock. Now, it won't always be that way. There will be, at a minimum, the election in November, and it'll probably end, but it'll probably end before that. But right now, it does seem to be trading like that.
Jim, appreciate some of the clarity from you, sir. As always, Jim Bianco there of Bianco Research on the latest. Let's give you an update on stories elsewhere with your Bloomberg Brief. Let's get across to Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. U.S. Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle is facing new calls to resign, this time from a bipartisan group of lawmakers following the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Cheadle is set to appear today at a congressional hearing with questions on how the shooter eluded security at the Pennsylvania Trump rally on July 13th. The shooting had been dubbed a catastrophic failure for the Secret Service. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has been summoned to testify as a witness in a criminal investigation involving his wife, Begoña Gómez. Gómez is under investigation for suspicion of influence peddling and private sector corruption. No charges have been filed, and the government denies that she committed any wrongdoing. The court says the Prime Minister will have to testify on July 30th. Now, speaking of Tesla CEO Elon Musk says the company will have, quote, genuinely useful humanoid robots in low production for internal company use beginning next year. Musk posted about the development on X, adding that the EV maker will hopefully begin high production of the robot for other companies starting in 2026. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Up next on the programme, resetting election bets.
Neither of them is going to be putting up taxes and cutting spending dramatically. There was a sense that Trump is putting policies in place intended to weaken the dollar in some form.
That conversation up next. Let's get to the stock market. Equity futures look like this, positive by 0.5 to 0.6%. In the bond market, yields a little bit lower, down 2 basis points, 421.74. What does this political mess, and we can call it that, what does it mean for foreign exchange? We'll get into that in just a moment. Euro dollar just south of 109, 108.87. Under surveillance this morning, resetting election bets.
Neither of them is going to be putting up taxes and cutting spending dramatically unless I've missed the scoop badly. So it's that the economy will determine. But in the period between now and the election, definitely there was a sense that Trump is putting policies in place which would tend to be sending the yen higher, for example, and are intended to weaken the dollar in some form.
It's the latest. Foreign exchange markets digesting President Biden's exit from the race and its impact on the election. Former President Donald Trump already telling Bloomberg the US has a currency problem. Thierry of Macquarie joins us now for more. Thierry, it's great to see you, sir. We'll start this conversation with a quote from Deutsche Bank. This is what they've got to say. Tariffs and their associated stronger implications for the dollar are significantly more likely to be the dominant market outcome than policies to pursue a weaker one. How do we set this up? And this is what we've all been trying to work out. We did this with Kit earlier. Are we saying that Republicans, that's bullish for the US dollar, and Democrats, if they win, it's bearish? Is it that simple, or is that too simple?
All else equal, that's the case. There are a few reasons why Trump 2.0 might be more inflationary than another Democratic administration. I think you can break it down to immigration and restrictions on immigration. There's a prospect here that a Trump administration could potentially remove 1 million workers from the U.S. workforce. So that's the first thing. The second thing is tariffs. We are talking about 10% tariffs across the board, potentially 60% on China. I've seen some analysis that suggests that can boost CPI by maybe almost 1% over the course of 2025 or after it's implemented. And the third thing is the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 into 2025 or beyond if it's passed by Congress. Of course, this would require that Congress and the House specifically are Republican. I think that would happen if Trump wins. So you have three things there that conceivably could be more inflationary. I know that it's the common wisdom out there is to associate the Biden administration with inflation, because that's effectively what we saw from 2021 to 2024, especially the first 3 years. But I think we're going to be looking at a different path for inflation under Republicans than Democrats, one whereby Republican inflation will be greater than Democratic inflation.
We've had fixed income strategists come on this program and say there's not much daylight between the two parties. Ultimately, they're going to issue more debt, and that on the budget side of things, all else equal, it will lead to higher yields. Are you saying there is a wide range of outcomes dependent on what the composition of government looks like, who owns what Congress looks like, who's in the White House, if we get a red sweep, blue sweep? Are they that wide, the outcomes?
I think to say that they are wide would be to say there might be a 150 basis point difference in the 10-year yield between a Republican administration and a Democratic administration. We're certainly not calling for that much of a difference. I think we're talking about prospectively a 40 basis point yield. Maybe under Democrats, the 10-year yield settles at maybe 435, 440. Maybe under Republicans, it converges towards 475 or 480. Those are the kinds of differences that we have in mind. But nonetheless, that will be positive for the dollar. The market will understand or come to understand that under a Republican administration, if you have more inflation, it will mean that the Fed's policy rates will continue to converge downwards, but not as fast or not to a point that they would converge to under a Democratic administration. In other words, the path for interest rates will be more shallow under a Republican administration than the Democratic administration.
John asked me earlier about Donald Trump's comment about the currency becoming a problem. Do you understand what the policy there is going to be, whether it's going to be strong dollar or weaker dollar to try to juice exports?
So I understand that what he's tried to do in the past is to try to weaken the dollar, and he's tried to do it by pressuring foreign countries to strengthen their currencies. That's clearly not what they're doing right now, right? I mean, if you look at China, for example, they're on a path to continuing to weaken their currency, and they're likely to do more of that if Trump becomes president, because they are going to be overly concerned at that point about the prospect for tariffs, and they're going to need to boost competitiveness. Now, will that create some sort of clash between China and the U.S.? Yes, it would. But the immediate implication of Chinese policy at this point is not going to be to strengthen the yuan in the face of these tariffs. It's going to be to weaken the yuan. And the Chinese are a very big economy in the within the global economy. What they do to their currency will influence what others, as they weaken their currency, will influence what happens to other currencies as well. So the path is still towards a stronger dollar, simply by virtue of what the Chinese might do in the face of these tariffs.
You know, John started by talking about this political mess, and I think a lot of people could say that very clearly, given the unprecedented nature of how quickly this was decided and how soon before the election. Is there anything in this noise, as so many people have described it, that undermines the idea of American exceptionalism, especially when facing off with the idea of stagflation?
Yeah, I certainly don't want to handicap this. We haven't even yet seen how the Democratic Convention is going to go. Let's also keep in mind that before we got to the 1960s, most of these conventions were brokered conventions, right? If you go back to Stevenson versus Eisenhower, this was a brokered convention. There was no candidate who had an outright majority necessarily going into the convention. There were pluralities, but not majorities. And it was at the time of the convention that you would actually find the candidate through brokering, through discussion, that the party would pick. So in some sense, we're going back to where we were many years ago. And no one would say, I think at this point, that was undemocratic back then. If anything, you can make a case it was more democratic. At least there was some discussion. We didn't have things like superdelegates, for example, at least not on the Democratic side. So I'm of the view that this is neither more democratic or less democratic than we had before. I'm a little bit concerned by the nature by which the news came out yesterday. It seems a little bit odd. I would attribute that to the fact that the president has COVID and probably could not do things the way he would normally do otherwise.
Does this make the DNC a market-moving event?
I think it could be a market-moving event if it's really disorganized, if we get to a point where there are street protests. It becomes a market event at that point because a lot of people, a lot of voters lose confidence in their ability to run the country because they can't even run a convention without disruption. In that sense, it could be a market-moving event. Yes, it could put the weight back onto the prospect that Trump becomes the president in 2025.
Terry, great to get your thoughts.
My pleasure.
Terry Wizman there of Macquarie on foreign exchange and the political considerations over the next 4 months, and the next 1 month as well. Messy process, potentially, for the Democrats.
Especially given the fact that they have to coalesce around somebody and then organize a very different-looking Democratic National Convention. I do want to sit for a minute on this idea of what happens during the remainder of Joe Biden's presidency. There is a real question, and people are wondering about what kinds of international incidents there could be if people view the United States as having a weakened hand. There are a lot of issues and notes that I've seen coming out in response to that.
He's going to finish his presidency as a lame duck. I think what this administration would like to focus on, you could see that today, Jake Sullivan will be sitting down with the families of those hostages taken by Hamas. He would like to shore up some sort of deal when it comes to Gaza. That is what he's going to be focused on. But he's going to be having this meeting with Netanyahu as a lame duck president. That is what it is.
Some news this morning from Senator Manchin speaking to CBS, an American broadcaster, in the last hour or so. I am not going to be a candidate for president. More on that story in just a moment. The third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance up next. Ed Mills of Raymond James, David George of Baird, Earl Davis of BMO, Matt Raskin of Deutsche Bank from New York. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance.
Right now, people don't know her that well.
I think it'll be an open process, but I don't see who runs against her.
There are some long-term implications, but I think in the near term, this is not something that's probably easily tradable.
The market doesn't seem to be interpreting Harris as a very strong candidate that could challenge Trump.
People underestimate Harris at their peril.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Live from New York City this morning. Good morning, good morning. The third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now. Let's start with the price action. Equity futures firmer, positive by around about 0.6% on the S&P. The outperformance on the Nasdaq by about 1 full percentage point. A couple of questions we've got to work through. What does the process over the next month look like? Also need to work out who is actually going to be the nominee. This is what we understand so far. We've got the big endorsement from the president himself for Kamala Harris, the vice president. We're waiting to see if we get a challenge from elsewhere. The only piece of information I can give you in the last hour, I can tell you who it won't be. According to a conversation with CBS, Senator Joe Manchin saying, I'm not going to be a candidate for president.
And we heard the collective shocked face of everybody who kind of sort of anticipated this. So questions now, did he get something in response to actively stepping down? And will he endorse Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? Bigger issue will be how much of a market-moving event, at least for me, this all will transpire to be when it comes to whether it's a continuation candidate or whether it's truly a new candidate running on a different platform with different policies. A lot of people saying it's more of the former, not the latter.
Well, this is the big issue. She's going to have to put some distance between her and the president when it comes to issues that are really not resonating with the American people. Goldman Sachs this morning, though, say the odds of Democrats winning the White House edge up with Biden stepping aside and putting her forefront. Also, what's been edging up, the cash that is rolling in. You look at these grassroots donations, about $50 million so far rolling in because she is, in some ways, a fresh face. She is younger, still attached to Biden's policies, but she is a new face in terms of the Democratic ticket, being the top of the ticket, and she's going to bring in an even fresher face when it comes to the VP pick. And wall-to-wall coverage will be about the Democrats and what their ticket looks like. And I have to say, that might start to infuriate the former president, who loves media coverage.
Hold on a second. How do you put distance between the president and yourself when you're the vice president and you've served under him for this long?
She's going to start to talk about different issues than he would normally talk about.
So it's a shift in emphasis.
I think it's going to be a shift in emphasis. She already has been the one that goes out and talks about women's reproductive rights. She is going to lean hard into that, especially given the fact that this is a weakness on Republicans. When you ask voters, most notably in a lot of polls, who do you trust, say, when it comes to the economy? They say the former President Donald Trump. Reproductive rights, they say Democrats.
People are trying to sniff out any difference. They find tech might be one place. And that's the reason why the tech outperformance today is particularly interesting to me. Is there this feeling that she will be more friendly to big tech companies based on when she previously tried to run for president and some of the discussions that she had at this time? People are trying to parse out that daylight, however small it may be, John.
I'll tell you how the market's passing things right now, or at least market participants. BTIG, fundamental view on all of this hasn't changed. OK, that's one. Here's another one. This from Oxford Economics. Biden's decision to drop out of the election doesn't warrant any immediate changes to our election scenarios, nor the policies we anticipate the Democrats pursuing if they were to win in November. What does this really change? And I understand that the Democrats wake up, for many of them, with the decision that they wanted on Sunday. Got all of that. And I understand that maybe they're excited. I think that's captured by the amount of money that's come into the campaign. But on the policy, on the polls, are we really sitting here and saying that Biden was doing badly in the polls and really badly in the swing states purely because of how old he was and how low his energy he had? Are we really saying it's down to those 2 points and it's not about policy?
How much of this is because people are expecting Kamala Harris to be the next president and seeing her as a much more likely candidate versus galvanizing turnout for the election? That's why we talk about the down ballot, how much this really was to sort of shift the odds of a Republican sweep, which is something that people said was much more likely after the debate.
When it comes to energizing the base, she's able to do that overnight. So the propensity of people to go out and vote that were potentially thinking about voting for a Democrat went up overnight because there was more interest in her. But the policy, to your point, there's going to be a different emphasis, I think, with Kamala Harris, but the policy is not going to change. And I go back to this poll a few months ago. When you ask people, this is what CNN put out, when you ask people who had a better presidency, former President Donald Trump or Biden, it was 55 versus 39. At the moment, it looks like when it comes to top two issues, immigration and the economy, they trust the former president.
Let's get into the price action, about an hour and 25 minutes away from the opening bell. If you are just joining us, welcome to the programme. Equity futures get a lift. They're up by about 0.6% on the S&P. Yields are a little bit lower, down 2 basis points. The 10-year, 421.74. Coming up this hour, we'll catch up with Ed Mills of Raymond James as Kamala Harris becomes the likely Democratic presidential nominee. David George of Baird weighing in on the Trump trade for the banking sector. And Matt Raskin of Deutsche Bank as investors look to reprice election risk. We begin with our top story. American politics rocked once again as President Biden backs out, endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris. Rising stars being floated as a potential VP pick, including Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, and Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. All this as Democratic fundraising tops $50 million in just a handful of hours following Biden's announcement. Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian joins us now for more. Jordan, this party has been a mess now for weeks. Can they clean it up and really start to go forward with a focus to win in November and beat Donald Trump?
Well, Jonathan, I would say in the roughly 24 hours since Kamala Harris became the nominee that she's done a lot to galvanize support on the Democratic side. She's made about 100 calls to stakeholders. She picked up some key endorsements, not only from President Biden, but from congressional leaders, battleground state lawmakers. And we haven't seen another candidate rise to the top here. And you have to remember, we have like a 3-week sprint until the Democratic convention. Whoever is going to challenge her, if someone's going to challenge her, they have to act fast if they hope to have a chance.
Jordan, why have we yet to hear from the President of the United States?
Well, Emery, he came down with COVID last week. I would discount that his illness, despite the rosy picture that the doctor's painting, would have something to do with that. He got dinged over the past few weeks for sounding pretty sickly in public appearances. And so I think part of the White House's calculation is they wanted to seem as healthy as possible the next time he comes out and speaks publicly.
Jordan, how are his closest allies, cabinet members, et cetera, handling this, given the fact that it has been a huge and sudden shift in tone after many weeks of asserting he was staying in the race?
It's interesting, Lisa, you've seen a lot of cabinet members, top congressional leaders quickly rally to Kamala Harris's side, but you're also seeing Republicans seize on that and say, hey, you guys were painting this rosy picture about the president's mental fitness and health for the last 3 years, and now you're just on a dime pivoting to Kamala Harris. Like what happened? Did you hide something from the American people? So as the party seeks to quickly coalesce around Kamala Harris, you're going to have this line of attack coming from Republicans.
Jordan, we're knee-deep in a race, and I understand why, but I think I've got to ask you this question. Where is the president, and why haven't we heard from him in the last 24 hours? Who wrote that letter? Where did it come from? Why have we had no follow-up? And when are we expected to hear from the president? Is it strange that we still have nothing on the schedule for this week?
Yeah, I think, again, the COVID is part of that process. We have heard from senior officials that he is going to see Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he comes to town this week in some capacity. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens middle of the week. And yes, I think for such a monumental announcement, you would expect to hear from the president personally. In that letter, which was crafted by President Biden and members of his senior staff, were told, there was a line in there that suggested that he's going to speak to this at some later date. So, perhaps when he recuperates, he'll be able to speak personally about this huge decision that he made.
Well, I think we all wish him well. Jordan, thank you, sir. Jordan Fabian there of Bloomberg down in Washington, D.C. Joining us now is Ed Mills of Raymond James. Ed, great to come back on the programme with you and catch up. Let's talk about this. What are you telling clients about what the next couple of weeks look like in this country?
Well, I think we have a lot of unknowns here and a lot of known unknowns. So we're looking to see, are Democrats going to coalesce around Kamala Harris? It seems like a yes. We want to know what the process is. We still have this uncertainty over the ballot deadline in Ohio for August 7th. That's before the Democratic convention. There's some quirks in their law that it might be able to kind of get pushed to the convention. But do Democrats want to wait that long? We want to see exactly who Kamala Harris, if she is the nominee, chooses as a vice president. And then we want to see how the American people and polling data react to that. So until we have those answers, what we've told clients at Raymond James is that we're not changing our election odds. We're not calling for a major market correction. We could see a stalling out of the Trump trade. We certainly have seen tech as a source of funds for that Trump trade. But, do we see a stalling out in the Russell 2000, in healthcare, energy, the financial services names that have done well since the debate? Certainly very possible. But this is still Trump's election to lose from our perspective. And if that Trump trade gets put back on, there's a lot of room to run. So it's not as if it's over. It's more of a pause. Let's reassess and see how the next couple of weeks play out, John.
If it's his election to lose, the former President Donald Trump, what does he need to do next to make sure that he is still out there campaigning? Because the RNC is over. He had his VP pick at the same time now that all the momentum is building on the Democratic side.
Yeah, Anne-Marie, I think it is holding the rallies, keeping the momentum coming out of the convention, highlighting kind of what he would like to do. I think it was really interesting over the weekend that I know that clients at Raymond James have been asking me a lot about Project 2025 and what a Trump policy agenda would look like. He threw that under the bus over the weekend and is saying that that's the extreme part of the Republican Party of the far right. He also kind of obviously throws the far left under the bus, but understanding for the American people what a Trump 2.0 would look like, and kind of building on that momentum, making sure that the swing states that kind of he looked like he had the lead in, he keeps that lead. And then also, I think you're seeing kind of within a couple of hours yesterday, one of the Trump-aligned super PACs coming out trying to define the opposition, trying to define Kamala Harris. And so, what type of narrative do they bring? Do they try to say that she was untrustworthy with kind of her views towards Biden? And does that play out into kind of how voters should perceive her? That would be job number 1, 2, and 3 in my mind.
I did hear the former president talk about Project 2025, and he said it's the far right, it's the extreme. But how can the American people believe him, given the fact that the individuals behind Project 2025 are linked to him and his former administration?
Yeah, so Anne-Marie, it's the question of the day because of the question is going to be how much is personnel become policy. Our expectations when we've talked to a number of folks around D.C. is that President Trump, if he were to win, the transition would look so much different than it was in 2016 when he didn't anticipate to win. But that said, a lot of these policy proposals are trying to get a lot of eyes on them, raise money for some of these think tanks. Ultimately, we would expect that a former President Trump reappoints a cabinet of rivals. And certainly there's a transactional nature to former President Trump. And so we'll go back once again, Anne-Marie, to this idea of take Trump seriously, but don't take it literally. And the literally is kind of those words of it. Certainly portions of that agenda would absolutely be adopted. But Trump as the transactional individual makes it not a kind of copy and paste for the next administration.
Ed, over the past 24 hours, how many calls have you fielded from clients? And what are the main conversations? What's the thrust of the topics that people want to know about?
Yeah, so what we did immediately last night is hosted a conference call, had almost 500 clients sign up for that at 9 o'clock at night on a Sunday. We polled them, and I think overwhelmingly there was the expectation on the call that Kamala Harris was going to be the was going to be the nominee. Looking to kind of get a sense of market impact. Overwhelmingly, clients still think that it is Trump's to lose, but people want to know a lot about process because they have been paying so much attention, Lisa, to this Trump trade. How much does that stall out? How much do they have to change this? They want to know a lot about who the vice president might be. Someone that we've highlighted is kind of going up the list. I don't know if he would be selected. Mark Kelly. I was with a group of people yesterday, non-political, and I gave the list of possible VP picks, and overwhelmingly everyone was excited about Mark Kelly because he was the one known figure to the average person out there compared to some of these governors. In D.C., we might get excited about some of these governors because they're from a swing state and how they are polling in their individual states. But their appeal outside of the state, I think, is a really interesting conversation. And does that give someone like a Mark Kelly a slightly higher chance than I think the market has been predicting? So those are the real questions, Lisa, that we've been getting over the last 24 hours.
Ed, let's just finish with this. And I want to talk about what I think has become a really lazy narrative over the last few weeks. If you listen to the reaction yesterday from certain quarters, it was as if the only thing holding back the president from winning in November was his age and his lack of energy. And Ed, I take real issue with that because two of the top issues, you survey, you poll anyone in this country, what comes up repeatedly as the top two issues, the economy and immigration. And they have been losing issues for the president repeatedly for the last 12 months. And I struggle to see how that changes with the vice president taking over the top of the ticket. How does that change, Ed?
Well, especially, and this is what you're going to hear a lot from Republicans, is that job number one that was given to the vice president was the border. And so if that is one of the top two issues, you had the number two person in this administration as her number one job. That's a political liability here. So what I have told folks at Raymond James is that, yes, there is a kind of chance that there's significant upside to a Kamala Harris candidacy. But there's also a chance that there's significant downside. And what we've been debating is, did Trump peak too soon, or is he still going to build strength? There is a real chance that if Trump is building strength, that this is a massive red wave, that the number of swing states only expand from now. And as much as some people were excited yesterday, they get really nervous in a week or two. That's certainly possible. But I think people were looking at the fact that President Biden was running well below other swing state Senate candidates.
Yeah.
And that needed to be the change. And at the very least, can they try to have a shot on goal in the House of Representatives? Try to keep some of these Senate seats so it is not a wipeout in the Senate that could be generationally impactful for any potential future Democratic nomination or majority in the Senate. I think that was first and foremost the concern here.
Ed, that's a really, really important thing to highlight. Thanks for that. Ed Mills there of Raymond James. The takeaway so far this morning, Raymond James, we're not changing our election odds. OK, 1, Oxford Economics. 2, doesn't alter our election scenarios. 3, BTIG, our fundamental view remains the same. The distinction that Ed drew at the end there, I think, is really important. Senate races, House races, and a race for the White House. Two different stories.
If this galvanizes voters, it changes the down ballot. It changes the House. It changes the Senate, potentially. And that's where people are looking for some shifts, potentially, in policy and outcomes.
So much we don't know. So much still to work out over the next month or so. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Staying with the presidential race, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin announced he will not, in fact, be running for president. Speaking to CBS News, the independent lawmaker walked back an earlier report from his office saying that he was seriously considering a run. The former Democrat also opted not to back Kamala Harris for the role. He called for a contested primary to choose the new nominee, something the party hasn't done since 1968. An investment partnership between Ray Dalio's family office and Abu Dhabi Royal Sheikh Tahnoon has been delayed. People familiar say that Bridgewater is still grappling with the legal terms of Dalio's exit from the firm. One open question: will Dalio use Bridgewater intellectual property if he goes forward with the tie-up? Dalio signed a non-compete when he left his hedge fund several years ago. Sheikh Tahnoon is one of Bridgewater's top clients. A check on Verizon shares this morning, down 3 1/3% in the pre-market. Second quarter operating revenue fell short of estimates. It saw fewer people upgrade their wireless equipment. The weak overall growth masked surprising gains in wireless phone customers and an increase in fixed wireless broadband internet customers. Verizon has been focusing on its fixed wireless product, which delivers internet over airways rather than through lines into a home. And that is your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Hey, Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes. Up next on the programme, the morning calls, plus David George of Baird on how the Trump trade could impact the banking sector and why he thinks maybe this bank rally has gone too far, too fast. The opening bow 1 hour and 9 minutes away. Equity futures going into that. A lift positive on the S&P, up by 0.6%, up almost 1% on the Nasdaq 100. Let's get you some morning calls. First up, Guggenheim downgrading CrowdStrike to neutral on the back of Friday's global tech outage. The analyst saying the event could negatively impact any new deals as CrowdStrike works to rehabilitate its reputation. That stock is down again this morning in the pre-market by almost 5%. Next up, JP Morgan upgrading Abercrombie & Fitch to overweight with a price target of 194. The analyst highlighting continued consumer demand, saying brand momentum is building internationally. We're up there by 2.5% in early trading. And finally, Goldman downgrading Lennar to neutral, the firm seeing less upside for the home builder in the coming quarters as it works on cost improvements. We're down by 1.4% there in pre-market trading. Let's turn to the financials. As President Biden bows out, investors are recalibrating their bets on the so-called Trump trade, including what it might mean for banks. David George of Baird saying the thesis holds little water, writing this, our valuation framework and through the cycle thought process suggests more limited upside in most bank names. We believe this replay of the Trump trade makes little sense to us this time around. David joins us now for more. David, let's get into that last line. Why does it make little sense this time in 2024 compared to, say, 2016?
Well, yeah. Good morning, John. It's good to see you again. So the Trump trade in 2016 was really the tax trade, in our opinion. As a reminder, corporate taxes went from 35% to 21%, and that's obviously a big delta and a big change. And the banking industry was the highest tax group in the S&P 500. So there was about a 12 to 13% earnings improvement on the heels of that tax reform in 2016. Given the fact that the U.S. is running 7% deficits in a highly functioning economy today, we think it's highly unlikely that you're going to see meaningful tax reductions in corporate America. And that's really where the upside in 2016 came from. And to set the context, John, we have been very bullish on regional banks. We've been on your show a lot over the last 12 to 18 months. We upgraded probably 13 banks, regional banks, specifically in the March, April, and May timeframe. And we've seen a complete U-turn in sentiment over the last couple of weeks, really since that debate. And again, we really think about banks on a risk-reward basis. And from our perspective, the reward today just isn't as compelling as it was a month or two ago.
So, David, have you reversed your call then to actually not recommend smaller banks anymore?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I would say we're neutral. We have been negative in the past, most recently in 2021. We're not quite at the level that we would tell market participants to short banks, but there's pretty limited upside from our perspective. And obviously, there's been a lot of movement in the Russell 2000, as you've said. And I think market participants, particularly in the mutual fund community, kind of came into this debate period maybe underweight or underrepresented in financials and banks specifically. So there was a little bit of maybe a rush to cover or a scramble to add exposure to financial services. So it's certainly not an overly expensive group today, but the upside, again, is just not as attractive as it was. And we've downgraded several names. We downgraded 2 last week, and we probably downgraded 8, Lisa, in the last couple of months.
David George of Baird. David, enjoy the note. Thank you, sir. David George there of Baird on the latest on the financials, on the regionals, on this bank rally we've seen over the last couple of weeks and whether it's justified. And I think the important point they're making over at Baird, led by David George, Lisa, the difference between where we are now and where we were back in 2016.
And the fact that, frankly, either way, it's going to be a highly taxed group. And a lot of what people said has been fully priced and then some. The idea of the reversal and call is interesting.
Just more cold water. We had it from Mike Wilson and Morgan Stanley, again from David George and Baird this morning. Up next on the programme, Matt Raskin of Deutsche Bank, Earl Davis of BMO, looking ahead to an interesting week ahead. No Fed speak, we're in the quiet period, decision time next week. We get some data, claims on Thursday, PCE on Friday. So we've got a few things to work out. It's a busy start, once again. Who said summers were quiet? I don't remember the last quiet summer. When was the last quiet summer? Going all the way back to sort of the Eurozone debt crisis of a decade plus ago.
Okay, there are two things. There's either quiet lack of news or quiet people not in their seats trading because they're going on vacation with their families because their kids are out of school. Two different things. If it's people not being in their seats, does that mean lower volume and then bigger moves just because it's quiet on the trading desk, but not necessarily in markets?
This is not quiet politically. It's the shortest presidential campaign we will have in history on the Democratic side, and I'm already starting to unfortunately have to rewind some of my vacation time.
I don't think we've had a news cycle like this since the pandemic. It's been that intense over the last few weeks. Equity futures look like this on the S&P, positive by 0.6%. Outperformance on the NASDAQ 100. You've got to remember the NASDAQ last week was down 4 percentage points. We're up 1% coming into earnings from Alphabet and Tesla in the next 24 hours or so. Reaction so far from the South side on the election? Kind of a shrug of the shoulders. I've got to tell you, all the excitement on the political networks, I get it, about the return of enthusiasm for the Democratic Party, maybe. But this is what Raymond James had to say to us earlier. We're not changing our election odds. Oxford Economics doesn't alter our election scenarios. BTIG, good friend of this program, Lisa Boltanski, our fundamental view remains the same.
And if you look at Predictive, for example, you can see that Donald Trump has gone down about 3 percentage points to 60% chance of winning from 63%. It's not a massive move as we take a look at what happens in November. The key issue is going to be down ballot, and we keep talking about that. How much does this remove a sort of de facto mandate that people sort of expected Donald Trump to get at the election? A lot remains uncertain, but that's where the conversation is this morning.
Isaac joining us tomorrow morning. Look out for that must-watch conversation. So in equities, 4-day losing streak on the S&P, attempting to bounce. In the bond market, lots of data to talk about through this week. The 2-year at 451.70, yields higher through last week. We've talked about it as a tug of war between retail sales good, jobless claims less good. That was last week. This week, it's about PCE on Friday and claims on Thursday.
Given the fact that there is this issue of how much is the deterioration in the labor market going to be also reflected in spending that, at least on the margins we're hearing, has been muted by a lot of CEOs. When you look at the bond market, I do think this week's auctions matter, just simply because this is the one theme from everyone who's trying to look past the noise, which is, i.e., ignore politics when you're trying to trade, and saying, regardless of who wins, their glut of supply is pretty dramatic. The fact that we've got $70 billion of 5-year notes being sold on Wednesday highlights this feeling of how do we digest this at a time that whoever wins is going to be dealing with an overhang of fiscal and, frankly, inflation that might rear its head again.
This is about funding the mess that we've seen down in D.C.
Correct.
And to carry on funding it. Let's switch up the board and get to foreign exchange. So euro-dollar, not much price action. Euro-dollar still in and around 109 at about 108.85. The headline of last week for me, away from the politics, it's about the FX market. To hear Donald Trump speak to Bloomberg Business Week and say, we've got a currency problem, and then to hear everyone on Wall Street turn around and say, what are you actually going to be able to do about it? Deutsche Bank this morning, we shared this quote a little bit earlier. I think it's worth repeating, Bramo. Tariffs and their associated stronger implications for the dollar are significantly more likely to be the dominant market outcome than policies to pursue a weaker dollar. It doesn't matter who you ask, the overwhelming consensus still remains, even if Donald Trump gets a second term and believes we have a dollar problem, they are going to be policies that lead to a stronger one.
Terry Wizman also said that essentially, regardless of how you look at it, a Donald Trump presidency, all things being equal, will be more inflationary and will favor a bit of a stronger dollar just because of what's happened in the past. This goes to this question, though, what do you trust? How much do you put faith in some of the policies that Donald Trump puts out there? Do you take him at his word in terms of his priorities at a time when sometimes his word is somewhat conflicted in terms of the market outcome?
That's the latest on the price action under surveillance this morning. A flavour of our top stories. There is none other than this one right here. President Biden ending his re-election bid, passing the torch to Vice President Kamala Harris. She's the favourite for the Democratic nomination heading into the party's convention next month. We were looking for a challenge. It doesn't look like, as of things right now, as things stand, it doesn't look like we're going to get one.
It doesn't. So it looks like we're going to go into the convention knowing who's on the ticket. That's August 19th in Chicago. So it doesn't look like we're going to have this open convention and more chaos within the Democratic Party. Now it's about the Veep stakes for her. Who's going to be her running mate? Andy Beshear this morning, speaking on MSNBC, says he'll do everything he can to support Harris. He's endorsing her. And then asked if anyone has reached out to him. You know, maybe he wants a rose. He said it's flattering to be part of it. He's not really sure about the process, but he's flattering to be part of it. Wall Street Journal said he was one of those individuals that she made a phone call to last night.
Crude a little bit lower this morning. WTI, it's a break of 80. We're down about 0.6%, 79.62. There is a meeting taking place this week. We've got the Israeli Prime Minister coming to Washington, D.C. He's going to address Congress. There will be a meeting at some point between him and the President of the United States. And I want to reflect on something Peter Chia of Academy Security said on this programme in the last couple of weeks. The rest of the world is watching this instability in this country over the last few weeks. And Peter Chia's words, and I'll paraphrase, but this is basically the essence of it. There could be some individuals, countries who look to take advantage of this.
Yes, they want to exploit what is happening in the United States, which looks like instability. Also, the fact of the matter is we have not seen the President of the United States, who said he's going to step aside and not seek re-election. We have not actually seen him say that to the American people. This all within a letter. Wall Street Journal editorial saying how that is not very good in terms of the U.S. standing on the international stage. When it comes to oil, Israel, Tel Aviv was hit over the weekend with a drone. The Israelis struck targets around a Houthi-led Red Sea port, potentially why we're seeing prices go a little bit higher. But that geopolitical risk, potentially that comes back into play ahead of November 5th.
This is what people have been talking about, why they thought Joe Biden would wait until after Netanyahu came to really make the announcement. The fact that he didn't raises just more questions about the timing and the process and, frankly, the appearance as well.
It felt very abrupt yesterday afternoon. It really did. And I think we've all got the same question. When are we going to hear from the sitting president, the president of the United States? As we all try and work out this election risk, the political factors in exchange markets, foreign exchange markets, equity markets, commodity markets. Also looking ahead to a Fed decision next week. We've got a ton of data this week. PCE coming on Friday, jobless claims coming on Thursday. Mike McKee's managed to make it back to New York, which was quite the mission, I understand, Mike.
It was a little difficult, and I probably missed all the calls from Kamala Harris asking if I was available. But no, I was flying on a certain airline that had a lot of problems.
Well, we can share that airline. It's in the news. Delta cancelling a lot of flights. Yeah. This is the hangover, the fallout from Friday, right? Yeah. What's been happening?
Well, I was 14 hours in the Jackson airport. Oof. Got a flight to Salt Lake City and spent 2 days in Salt Lake City because all my flights out of there were canceled. But the Delta employees in the airports were just marvelous. Professional, calm, cool, collected. And I don't know how they managed to do that with thousands of people lined up to talk to them.
Anyone who's been to Jackson Airport, great view out the windows, not much to do. So I'm not sure what you did for 13 hours. Mike, it's great to have you back. We're looking ahead to next week. Go through the data points for this week that you're super focused on.
Well, the big ones are at the end of the week. It's one of those where we get second quarter GDP. That's going to be an interesting number because a lot of it depends on inventory build. And there were some issues with automobiles not selling as much last month. But the bottom line is economists are expecting 1.9%, but Atlanta Fed GDP now is 2.7%. So somewhere, that's a pretty big range, but it does show the economy's still growing. Jobless claims you talked about. One thing we forgot last week, and it's my fault for forgetting, is Hurricane Beryl in Houston. A lot of people in Houston, Texas was the state with the biggest number of jobless claims. So that could, in theory, go down. Economists are expecting it to go down, and then we wipe out all the concerns about the labor market until Friday when we get the PCE inflation numbers. And because we've talked about this before, you can pretty much figure them out once you have CPI and PPI. We're expecting drops again there, headline number to 2.4, which has got to be in the range the Fed is looking for to start their process of cutting. So there'll be a little bit of talk about July if it comes in that way, unless it comes in much lower. But then it really sets us up for September.
You highlight why PCE sort of has already been revealed to some people just because you can calculate it just de facto with CPI and PPI, which is the reason why in some ways I'm more interested in consumer spending, especially in light of some of the warnings that we've heard from airlines, from different food operators, this idea that there is more sort of concern among consumers and discretion. How much are people expecting that to be reflected in the numbers, sort of flying in the face of what we got last week?
Well, the expectation is we see an increase from a 0.2 rise to a 0.3 rise in the month of June. And if that happens, that makes for a much better launching pad for the third quarter. But at this point, it looks like consumers are hanging in there. And that's the big thing in the retail sales report. Very strong under the headlines because auto sales we knew would be bad and gasoline goes up and down on price. But everything else was fairly strong. So if services spending comes in the same way, then the Fed is got to be pretty happy. At some point, we got to call it a soft landing.
Mike McKee in the room next week. Let's see if they call it just that, in anticipation of what many people think will be a rate cut in September. Also struggling with some of those flights. I know many of you have been. Check out the airlines in the pre-market down across the board. Once again, this has been a real struggle. Even if you push the tech outage of Friday to one side, it's been difficult for the airlines. This started with Delta at the very beginning of earnings season, coming out and saying Q2 has been tough. We're down another 1% on Delta. United followed up with the same story, down by 1.1%. And then, Lisa, earlier on this morning over in Europe, heard almost exactly the same thing in a different market from a different airline. This time, it was Ryanair.
This is basically a 1-2 punch. On one hand, they're not able to charge customers an endlessly increasing fare, but also you're seeing expenses increase. Think about how expensive it was, this outage, for the likes of Delta and others that had to deal with canceled flights. They had to give people free, refocused flights. They had to talk about perks. They had to potentially even put people up in hotels en masse. This is an expense at the same time that they cannot offset it in the same way that they have been able to in the past.
Ryanair over in Europe down by 15%. That is a difficult day for that particular airline. Joining us now to discuss the week ahead and the Federal Reserve decision still to be made for the year ahead, Matt Raskin of Deutsche Bank alongside Earl Davis of BMO. Earl, I want to come to you first, and I want to understand where this economy is at. And I'll share the words of Mike Gapon over at Bank of America with you. He said, cooling, yes, cool, no. Is that how you would characterize this economy?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization, especially, when you look at the city, economic surprise index, that's at 9-year lows. So cooling, yes, but there's a lot of fiscal support underneath. So cool, no. So I fully agree with that assessment.
So, Earl, how much do you see politics as sort of noise and the sort of big story right now being that yields are going to remain higher for longer because of the strength, because of some of the inflation that you have talked about extensively?
No, you know what? I don't see it as noise. I actually see it as providing a great trade opportunity. And why I say that is both the Democrats and the Republicans are still going to have significant fiscal deficits. So that's supportive of the economy going forward. Having said that, you almost get like a free option on a steepener with a Republican win because of the deregulatory thrust that they will bring to the market. Bringing in that deregulatory thrust, that impacts small and medium-sized businesses the most in regards to a reduction of costs. Those costs being put back into business, and they are the biggest employers. It's not your Microsofts or your Amazons. It's actually small and medium-sized businesses. That could get a thrust, an economic thrust to the market. So you need risk premium for that, which is why we like the steepener now. We think it's it's a heads I win, tails you lose scenario, whether it's a bull steepener or a bear steepener.
Matt, do you agree with that? Basically, that we're looking at longer-term deficits in the long term and near term, this idea that the Fed can either hold rates here or cut them, that's going to be a steepener regardless of who wins.
I would tend to agree with that. I think you, as Earl pointed out, on the election side and the outlook for fiscal, I think regardless of which party wins, we're looking at big fiscal deficits as far as the eye can see. I do think that as Trump's election odds go up, the odds of a sweep election also go up, and that is the scenario that's likely to produce the biggest fiscal deficits. That's inflationary. It also increases Treasury supply and should boost term premium, provide some steepening in yield curves through that channel. At the same time, as the Fed is moving towards a first rate cut, which seems very likely to come in September, we're naturally going to get some steepening in the curve that comes from that. So I do think both of those big stories that are at play in markets right now on the election and the Fed pivoting to rate cuts are supportive of steepeners.
Matt, do you think the market needs to take into consideration that potentially with Biden stepping aside, there is more momentum behind VP Harris?
I do. I mean, I think, the developments over the weekend, over the past month are shifting the range of possible outcomes coming out of the election. They're shifting the likelihoods of those different outcomes. And I think the market needs to take that into account. As I think you pointed out earlier, the move in, predicted election probabilities over the weekend, are notable, but not that big. And I think we've generally seen, in rates at least, a response that's in line with what we'd seen previously as we got big shifts in the odds of Trump winning the election. And that tends to be, higher yields and steeper curves. And so I think as those odds are moving around, as the likelihood that, that the Democrats, win the presidency increase, albeit modestly, the market should take that into account. It should be reflected in somewhat flatter yield curves, which is what we've seen today. I guess the one thing that I'd point out is all of the dynamics that we talk about as being at play with the election, the prospects of more expansionary fiscal policy, the impact that can have on the level of yields and shape of the curve, those impacts on yields and the curve are also those things are also heavily driven by the outlook for Fed policy. And so, as you pointed out, we get important data later this week. We have a Fed meeting next week. We get the next employment report at the end of next week. And so I just think those things are potentially going to swamp any effect that you see coming out of shifts in election odds from developments over the weekend.
Matt, I asked this question last night. I'll ask it again. So what matters more in August? Is it Jackson Hole or the DNC?
I think we're probably going to have good clarity around what will come from the Democratic National Convention ahead of time in August. I actually think Chair Powell's remarks at Jackson Hole are likely to be quite important. The way I see things unfolding from here, I think at next week's meeting, the Fed is not going to make any changes to the Fed funds rate, but I do think that they'll signal that a first cut is coming in September. I think what Chair Powell is likely to use his remarks at Jackson Hole to then do is frame the cutting cycle and provide some perspective that will, probably help to temper any inclination that markets might have to price in a very aggressive Fed cutting cycle once they begin to cut in September. So I actually think that framing that we're likely to get from Powell at Jackson Hole is going to be quite important.
Just to build on that, do you think the framing that we could get from Jackson Hole, from Chairman Powell on the issue that Matt described, do you think it might be similar to what we've heard from the ECB?
That's a tough question. And the reason why is because of the fiscal impulse that we're talking about and deregulatory, that's actually extremely stimulative after the election. So I do think there will be some pointing towards eases, but they have to be tentative as to the significance or quantum of a possible easing cycle. So I think you have to watch out there. Having said that, I do think one important thing about August and about the bond markets in general now, and you could say it's because of summer, there's different reasons. There is a sense of complacency in the bond market. When you look at the volatility index, the MOVE index, we're below 100. It doesn't stay below 100 for long since COVID. So my expectation is that volatility will increase and will spike, whether it be DNC, whether it be Jackson Hole. I think those are two very real possibilities. Also, next week's Fed meeting, the market's only discounting a 2.5% chance of an ease. We think it's greater than 25%. So there's a lot of reasons here to expect the market to not be as complacent for as long.
Interesting. Earl, wonderful to catch up with you, sir. Earl Davis of BMO. And likewise with you, Matt Raskin of Deutsche Bank. Gents, thank you. Big week ahead. Looking ahead to next week, Federal Reserve decision, some jobless claims data on Thursday. Mike, just to come back to you just briefly on jobless claims, given Hurricane Beryl and what you described as maybe some impact on the claims number of last week, how reliable is the incoming labour market data going to be over the next few weeks?
Well, part of the problem is that July is usually a very bad month for jobless claims accuracy because a lot of manufacturing companies shut down briefly to retool, particularly the auto companies, and that happens on a rolling basis. So throughout the month, you're not really sure whether the jobless claims are accurate or not. And that just builds into that whole situation. But if they go down, in part because people went back to work in Houston, then that'll be seen as a relatively good sign.
I guess the good news for the Federal Reserve is they're not in the business of forward guidance anymore. Can you imagine if they were? How do you construct forward guidance around this?
The good news for them is that they're in the quiet period this week as everyone talks about politics. Could you imagine if they had to actually weigh in on any of this stuff?
Yeah, although Chairman Powell gave us a different template last week of how to avoid it.
Basically.
Just don't answer questions.
Well, we've heard that before. Either way, to me, it's fascinating to see. Basically, we're in a black box that's clouded with a cloth over it that's tied up in knots. I mean, basically, we're talking about the data not being as accurate during this time of year, an election that's haywire, and a lot of people really questioning what the policies are going to be that they can analyze.
I've heard the Chairman Powell speechwriter watches this show. Do you remember the line from last August, navigating the stars under cloudy skies? I wonder if they borrowed that line you just said. You'd have to repeat it, though, because I've forgotten it already. Black box under what?
Well, a cloth with a bunch of knots tied up all around
and clouds
it.
above it, too.
Yeah, clouds,
okay,
rain cloud.
They're sort of there making notes now, I'm sure.
I don't think anyone's making notes.
Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. They're not. With your Bloomberg Brief, here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin has told CBS News that he will not be running for president.
I am not running for office. I could not believe that there was not going to be a primary process or a mini process. Other countries do it. I'm not looking for I don't need that as far as in my life, the attention that people think that, when you speak up, you're just looking for attention. Why is everyone afraid to speak out?
Previous reports had suggested the independent lawmaker was considering a run for the Democratic nomination. Manchin also telling MSNBC moments ago that he is retiring. Delta Airlines is apologizing for canceling thousands of flights during the busiest travel weekend of the summer, as many of its systems failed following the catastrophic CrowdStrike outage on Friday. Delta CEO Ed Bastian blamed the impact on a significant number of functions that rely on Microsoft Windows operating systems, including its crew tracking tools, which rendered the airline unable to process large volumes of changes to flight personnel. Delta is still experiencing flight cancellations today. Morgan Stanley's chief U.S. equity strategist Mike Wilson sees the U.S. small cap rally losing steam. He wrote in his latest note that the recent outperformance is facing technical resistance and lacks fundamental drivers to carry on. More specifically, the rally lacks justification in terms of profits compared to past rallies. The Russell 2000 is up 6.7% this month compared to 0.8% for the S&P, driven by softer inflation and the rising odds for another Donald Trump presidency. And that's your brief, John.
Danny, thank you. Thanks for this morning. We'll catch up tomorrow. Up next on this programme, we'll set you up for the week ahead. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance. We're counting you down to the opening bell. Here's the calendar. The trading diary for the week ahead looks like this. At 11:30, Vice President Harris making her first public appearance since being endorsed by President Biden, giving remarks at the White House. On Tuesday, Alphabet and Tesla reporting results after the closing bell. Wednesday, more earnings from Ford and IBM. Plus, we'll get some US PMIs for you. Thursday, US GDP and another round of jobless claims. And we round out the week on Friday with UMich sentiment and PCE. I guess we've got to get some final thoughts. I said at the start of the programme, it's like last week never ended. In fact, I have to say, July started and then there was no weekend from there, Bramo. Things have changed a lot
And it's all political, right? I mean, basically, there's just absolute political turmoil. I would say the real question for me this week, from a market's perspective, as Anne-Marie will talk about the politics more significantly, is how much potentially some of the earnings can really take center stage if they really do provide more of a compass than the black box wrapped in a cloth with lots of knots around it.
And clouds and rain.
Of politics, doesn't provide people with that clarity.
I'm excited for the South Lawn event that I would normally never pay any attention to at all. She's going to be talking with the championship teams of the NCAA, but now it's a big moment. It's the first time she's going to address the public since being endorsed by the president to take on the top of the ticket. What does she say? She came out yesterday and says she wants to make sure that she earns and wins the Democratic delegate support and earns that nomination. What does she have to say for herself? And then TBD, when the President of the United States actually speaks, he drops this letter, and we still have not seen or heard from him, and we don't have a date yet.
We're waiting for that date and what that schedule looks like. We've got a lot to work through. We'll try and get things started in the right way tomorrow morning. Here's the lineup. Russ Kostrick of BlackRock, Isa Boltansky of BTIG, Democratic Congressman Jake Ochinklos of Massachusetts, and Jill Carey Hall of Bank of America. From New York City, this was Bloomberg Surveillance.